The crisp Wyoming air bit at my face as I stepped out of my truck at the Bighorn National Forest Ranger Station. It was October 1977, and after 4 months on the job, I still couldn't believe this was my life now. The vast wilderness stretched before me, a patchwork of deep greens and golds as autumn took hold of the landscape. My name is George Williams, and this is the story of how my dream job became a nightmare. I'd grown up in Chicago, where the closest thing to wildlife was the occasional raccoon digging through garbage bins. The constant symphony of car horns and elevated trains had been my lullaby for 28 years. But something had always called me to the wilderness, a yearning I couldn't explain. When I saw the job posting for a park ranger position in Wyoming, I didn't hesitate. The other rangers had welcomed me warmly enough, though I could tell they were waiting to see if I'd make it through my first winter. Kevin Harrow, a veteran ranger with 15 years under his belt, had taken me under his wing. He was the kind of man who seemed to know every tree in the forest by name, every animal track by sight, and every weather pattern by heart. "Morning, George," Kevin called out as I entered the station. He was hunched over a map, his coffee leaving rings on the worn wooden desk. "Got some reports of illegal hunting up near Crazy Woman Canyon. Mind checking it out?" I nodded, grateful for the assignment. The canyon had become one of my favorite spots in the forest, despite its peculiar name. "Any particular areas I should focus on?" Kevin traced a path with his finger along the map. "There's been activity around these old campsites here and here. Probably just some yahoos thinking they can get away with hunting out of season, but better safe than sorry." I gathered my gear methodically: radio, first aid kit, binoculars, and my standard issue rifle. The weapon felt heavy against my shoulder, a constant reminder of the responsibility that came with the badge. In 4 months, I'd never had to use it for anything more threatening than warning shots to scare off aggressive wildlife. The drive to Crazy Woman Canyon took about an hour, the dirt road winding through increasingly remote territory. The radio crackled occasionally with updates from other rangers, their voices providing a tenuous link to civilization. As I drove deeper into the forest, the trees seemed to press in closer, their branches creating a canopy that filtered the morning light into ghostly patterns on the ground. I parked at the trailhead and began my patrol on foot. The air was unusually still that morning, the typical chorus of birdsong notably absent. My boots crunched on fallen leaves, the sound seemingly amplified in the unnatural quiet. Something felt off, but I couldn't put my finger on what. The first campsite showed signs of recent use: a fire pit with warm ashes, empty beer cans, and food wrappers scattered about. I documented the scene with my camera and collected the trash, making mental notes for my report. It wasn't until I reached the second site that things took a turn I never could have anticipated. The stillness was broken by a rustling in the underbrush. I turned, expecting to see a deer or perhaps a black bear, common enough sights in these parts. What I saw instead would haunt my dreams for years to come. He stood at the edge of the clearing, partially obscured by the shadows of the pine trees. At first glance, he appeared to be just a man, tall and gaunt, but something about him was fundamentally wrong. His skin had an almost translucent quality, like paper held up to light, and his eyes, his eyes were too large, too dark, seeming to absorb the morning light rather than reflect it. My training kicked in automatically. "Sir, this is a restricted area. I need to see your camping permit." My voice sounded hollow in the still air. He didn't respond, didn't blink, didn't move. Just stood there staring at me with those impossible eyes. His clothes hung in tatters from his frame, not the typical gear of a hiker or hunter. They looked ancient, as if he'd been wearing them for decades. I took a step closer, my hand instinctively moving to my rifle. "Sir, I need you to respond. Are you all right?" The movement was so fast I almost missed it. One moment he was standing at the edge of the clearing, the next he was directly in front of me, his cold hand gripping my rifle. The speed was inhuman, impossible. His touch sent waves of ice through my body, a bone-deep cold that seemed to freeze my very thoughts. We struggled for the weapon, but his strength was overwhelming. Up close, I could see that his skin wasn't just pale. It had a gray, mottled quality that made my stomach turn. His breath, when it hit my face, carried the musty sweetness of decay. Through sheer desperation, I managed to wrench the rifle free and stumble backward. My heart hammered against my ribs as I raised the weapon. "Stay back," I shouted, my finger trembling on the trigger. He tilted his head slightly, the movement jerky and unnatural, like a puppet on strings. Then his mouth opened, revealing teeth that were too sharp, too numerous. No sound came out. I ran. I'd like to say I stood my ground, that I followed procedure, that I handled the situation with the professionalism my badge demanded. But in that moment, facing something that shouldn't exist, all my training evaporated. I ran back to my truck, falling twice in my panic, the sound of my own ragged breathing drowning out everything else. Only when I was inside the vehicle, doors locked and engine running, did I reach for my radio with trembling hands.
Base, this is Williams. I've got a situation at Campsite B in Crazy Woman Canyon. Need backup immediately.
Kevin's voice crackled back, concern evident even through the static. What kind of situation, George? Over. I hesitated. How could I describe what I'd seen without sounding crazy? Possible hostile individual, attempted to grab my weapon, request immediate assistance. Copy that. Stay put. We're sending help. I kept my eyes on the trees, scanning for any movement. The man, if that's what he was, had vanished as quickly as he'd appeared. By the time backup arrived 20 minutes later, there was no trace of him. No footprints in the soft earth, no broken branches marking his passage, nothing to prove he'd ever been there at all. The following days blurred together in a haze of questioning and paperwork. My fellow rangers searched the area thoroughly, but found nothing. No tracks, no traces, no evidence that anyone had been there besides me. I could see the doubt in their eyes, the way they exchanged glances when they thought I wasn't looking. Look, George, Kevin said one evening, as we sat in the station after hours. I've been doing this job for 15 years. Sometimes the forest, it plays tricks on your mind. The isolation, the silence, it can get to you. I stared into my coffee, now cold and bitter. I know what I saw, Kevin. This wasn't some trick of the light, or my imagination running wild. He was real. Whatever he was real. Kevin leaned back in his chair, the wood creaking under his weight. Maybe it was a homeless guy. We get 'em sometimes, living off the grid in the deeper parts of the forest. They can look pretty rough after a while. But I couldn't shake the memory of those eyes, that impossible speed, the otherworldly wrongness of his movements. No homeless person could move like that. No person could. The other rangers started treating me differently. They paired me up more often, claimed it was for safety, but I knew they were worried about me. I heard whispers about stress leave, about how the job wasn't for everyone. I started doubting myself, questioning my memories. Maybe they were right. Maybe the isolation was getting to me. Then the dreams started. Every night I'd see him standing at the foot of my bed, those black eyes boring into mine. I'd wake up gasping, sheets soaked with sweat, the room temperature seemingly dropped by 20 degrees. Sometimes I'd find my windows open, though I was sure I'd locked them before going to bed. I started keeping a journal, documenting everything. The dreams, the temperature drops, the strange sounds I'd hear at night. I needed proof, something concrete to show I wasn't losing my mind. It was Kevin who found it first. A crisp morning in late October, the kind where frost crunches under your boots and your breath hangs in the air like smoke. The radio crackled to life just as I was finishing my morning patrol. George, Kevin's voice was tight, controlled. I need you to come to the old Miller campsite, now. I knew from his tone that something was wrong. The drive seemed to take forever, though it couldn't have been more than 15 minutes. When I arrived, I found Kevin standing at the edge of the clearing, his face ash gray. The body lay scattered across the campsite like pieces of a grotesque puzzle. The victim had been torn apart with impossible strength, limbs wrenched from their sockets, flesh shredded by something sharper than any animal's claws. The ground was saturated with blood, yet there were no tracks, no signs of struggle. Jesus Christ, I whispered, fighting down the bile rising in my throat. Kevin radioed it in while I secured the perimeter. As we waited for the authorities, I saw something that made my blood freeze. There at the edge of the trees, a familiar figure, watching us with those bottomless black eyes. Kevin. I grabbed his arm, pointing, but by the time he turned, the figure was gone. The victim was identified as James Morrison, a local hunter who'd been reported missing a week earlier. The official investigation pointed to an animal attack, possibly a grizzly, though no one could explain the lack of tracks or the peculiar way the body had been dismembered. I knew better. The pattern of destruction, the surgical precision of some of the cuts. This was no animal attack. This was something else entirely. The sightings increased after that. I'd catch glimpses of him everywhere, between the trees during patrols, in the reflection of my truck's windows, standing in the shadows of the station at dusk. Each time, he'd vanish the moment someone else looked. My colleagues' concern turned to worry, then to fear. They saw the dark circles under my eyes, the way I jumped at shadows, how I'd stopped eating in the break room, preferring to keep my back to a wall and my eyes on the windows. I started carrying my rifle everywhere, even off duty. I installed extra locks on my doors and windows, bought security cameras for my small cabin. The footage would often glitch around 3 a.m., showing static for exactly 7 minutes before returning to normal. One night, reviewing the footage, I saw him, standing perfectly still in my yard for hours, head tilted at an impossible angle, staring directly into the camera. When I ran outside with my rifle, he was gone, but the grass where he'd stood was frozen solid despite the warm summer night. I tried to find patterns, some logic to his appearances. I pored over local history books, searching for similar stories. In the deepest archives of the local library, I found mentions of similar sightings dating back to the 1800s. Stories of a tall, pale figure seen before disappearances, of hunters found torn apart, of children who vanished into the woods never to return. The more I discovered, the more he appeared. It was as if my knowledge of him somehow drew him closer, made him stronger. It ended where it began. In a way, I was home, trying to lose myself in mindless television when the power went out. The temperature dropped suddenly, my breath visible in the darkness. I knew he was coming. I grabbed my rifle and waited. The security cameras had gone dead, but I didn't need them. I could feel his presence, like a weight pressing against my skull. When I saw him standing in my yard, I didn't hesitate. I went outside to face him, knowing this had to end one way or another. "What do you want?" I shouted into the darkness. "Why are you doing this?" He moved then, faster than ever before, closing the distance between us in an eye blink. His hand closed around my throat, cold as the grave, strong as steel. Up close, his face was even more horrible than I remembered. Not just pale, but somehow wrong, as if someone had tried to craft a human face without ever having seen one. I struggled against his grip, feeling my consciousness fading. This was it, I thought. I was going to end up like Morrison, another mysterious death in the forest. The gunshot rang out like thunder. The creature's grip loosened as it staggered backward, black liquid seeping from a wound in its chest. I fell to my knees, gasping for air. Kevin stood at the edge of my property, his rifle still raised. "I've been following you," he admitted as he helped me up. I knew something was wrong, really wrong. I just didn't know what, until now. We both watched as the creature retreated into the darkness, leaving a trail of black fluid that seemed to evaporate as it hit the ground. It never made a sound. I left the ranger service the next week. Kevin tried to convince me to stay, said we could face this thing together, but I'd had enough. I moved to Arizona, where the desert's stark openness felt safer than the close darkness of the forest. The official report listed the Morrison case as an unsolved animal attack. My encounter was explained away as stress-induced paranoia. Kevin never told anyone what he saw that night, though he sends me updates every few months, keeping me informed of any unusual incidents in the forest. Sometimes on cold nights when the wind howls just right, I think I see a tall, pale figure standing in the distance, but I've learned to look away, to not acknowledge it. Perhaps that's why I survived when others didn't. I learned when to stop looking, when to walk away. The Bighorn National Forest still stands beautiful and mysterious as ever. Tourists still camp there, hikers still wander its trails, and rangers still patrol its vast expanses. But if you go there, and if you see something strange in the shadows, something that moves too fast or stands too still, don't look too long. Don't try to understand it. Just walk away, because some mysteries aren't meant to be solved, and some watchers should remain in the woods. My name is James Jones, and this happened to me on August 14, 1998. I was 32 years old at the time, working as a search and rescue officer in a small town called Pinecrest, Maine. It's the kind of place where everyone knows everyone, tucked away in the dense forests near the Canadian border. Nothing much ever happened in Pinecrest, which is probably why I took to my job with such dedication. But let me tell you, nothing could have prepared me for the horrors I witnessed that summer. The day started like any other. I was at the station, sipping on a stale cup of coffee and trying to shake off the remnants of sleep. Our team was small, just me and my partner Tom Halloran, along with a handful of volunteers we could call on if needed. Tom and I had been working together for years, and we had a good rhythm. We knew the forests around Pinecrest like the back of our hands, or so we thought. Around 10 a.m., a call came in about a missing hiker. A woman named Claire Donovan, age 28, had gone out for a hike the previous morning and hadn't returned. Her husband Hank was frantic with worry. Claire was an experienced hiker, he told us over the phone. She knew the trails well. It wasn't like her to just disappear. Tom and I met Hank at the trailhead. He was a tall, wiry man with a thick beard, and the dark circles under his eyes told me he hadn't slept a wink. "She's done this hike a dozen times," he kept saying, his voice strained with anxiety. "She knows the area like the back of her hand." We assured Hank that we'd do everything we could to find his wife. Tom and I set out, calling in a couple of volunteers to help with the search. The trail was one we were familiar with, a moderately challenging hike that led up through dense pine forest and then along the edge of a steep ridge. It was a beautiful area, but treacherous if you didn't know what you were doing. We figured Claire might have twisted an ankle or gotten turned around. It happens even to experienced hikers. The first few hours of the search were uneventful. We called Claire's name until our voices were hoarse, scanned the thick underbrush for any sign of disturbance, checked the trail for footprints or broken branches. But there was nothing. It was as if Claire had simply vanished into thin air. By late afternoon, a sense of unease had settled over our small search party. This was longer than any search should have taken, especially on a trail we knew so well. Hank was beside himself with worry, pacing at the trailhead like a caged animal. We had to gently but firmly tell him to stay put. The last thing we needed was another person getting lost in the forest. As the sun began to sink lower in the sky, painting the trees in shades of gold and crimson, Tom and I made the decision to push deeper into the woods. We left the main trail, following a narrow game path that snaked through the undergrowth. The forest seemed to close in around us, the trees pressing close, their branches intertwined overhead until only slivers of the fading light penetrated the canopy. It was then that we found the first sign of Claire. It was a scarf, a bright splash of red against the muted greens and browns of the forest floor. It had snagged on a broken branch, fluttering forlornly in the breeze. Tom and I exchanged a look. Hank had mentioned Claire was wearing a red scarf when she set out. "Over here," I called to Tom, my voice sounding muffled in the heavy air. He jogged over, his boots crunching on the carpet of pine needles. We both stared at the scarf, a sense of foreboding settling over us like a shroud. "Think she just dropped it?" Tom asked, but there was doubt in his voice. I wasn't sure. Maybe, but let's keep moving. We're on the right track. We pressed on, calling Claire's name, the sound echoing back to us from the indifferent trees. The light was fading fast now, shadows pooling beneath the pines. About an hour later, as we were fighting our way through a particularly dense patch of underbrush, we found another clue. It was a water bottle, half buried in the soft loam. Tom picked it up, turning it over in his hands. There was a name scribbled on the side in black marker, Claire. A jolt of excitement mixed with apprehension shot through me. We were close now, I could feel it, but it was the next discovery that stopped us cold. We stumbled into a small clearing, and at first glance it appeared to be an ordinary campsite, but something was off. There were no tents, no sleeping bags, no cheerfully crackling campfire. Instead, there was a haphazard circle of stones, the ashes inside them long cold. Scattered around were a few forlorn-looking belongings, a tattered backpack, a single hiking boot, a rusted pocket knife. Tom and I stood there, the hair on the backs of our necks standing up. This was no ordinary campsite. It looked like it had been abandoned in a hurry, and a long time ago. But the most unsettling thing was the silence. The forest was always quiet, but this was different. It was a heavy, oppressive silence, like the trees themselves were holding their breath. And then we saw it, partially hidden beneath a drift of leaves, almost as if it had been placed there deliberately, was a shoe. A woman's hiking boot, the mate to the one we'd seen earlier. Tom picked it up gingerly, as if it might bite him. He turned it over in his hands, his face grim. "This is Claire's, isn't it?" he asked, although it wasn't really a question. "I think so," I said. My voice sounded strange to my own ears, thin and strained. "But what the hell is this place?" Neither of us had an answer. A glance at the sky told us night was fast approaching. It wasn't safe to keep searching in the dark, not in this part of the forest. Reluctantly, we decided to make camp nearby and resume our search at first light. We pitched our small two-man tent in a spot that gave us a clear view of the strange campsite. As Tom set about building a fire, more for comfort than warmth in the muggy August night, I radioed back to the station. I told them what we'd found, trying to keep the unease out of my voice. They promised to send out additional search parties in the morning to widen the search radius. Hank, they told me, was still at the trailhead, refusing to leave. That night was one of the longest of my life. I lay in my sleeping bag staring up at the tent's ceiling, my mind whirring. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig had me jerking upright, my heart pounding. Tom seemed to be faring no better. I could hear him tossing and turning, his breathing heavy in the darkness. At some point I must have drifted into a fitful sleep, because I woke with a start. It took me a moment to realize what had woken me. It was a scream, distant but unmistakable, echoing through the trees. Beside me, Tom sat bolt upright, his eyes wide. "Did you hear that?" he whispered. I was already scrambling out of my sleeping bag, fumbling for my boots. It sounded like it came from the north. We burst out of the tent, flashlights in hand. The scream came again, louder this time, and filled with terror. It was a woman's voice, Claire's voice. "This way," I yelled, plunging into the trees. Tom was right behind me, his breathing harsh in the still night air. We ran, heedless of the branches that whipped at our faces, the roots that tried to trip us. The screams grew louder, more desperate, urging us onward. And then, as suddenly as they had started, they stopped. The silence that followed was more terrifying than the screams. We burst into another clearing, and the scene before us was like something out of a nightmare. Claire was there, her body sprawled on the forest floor, but she wasn't alone. Crouched over her was a creature straight out of a horror movie. It was humanoid, but larger than any man I'd ever seen. Its skin was a sickly grayish-green, covered in what looked like scales, but it was its face that I'll never forget. It had no nose, just two slitted nostrils. Its eyes were large and black, reflecting the light of our flashlights, and its mouth, it was wide and gaping, filled with rows of needle-like teeth. The creature looked up as we entered the clearing, and let out a hiss that sent shivers down my spine. It moved, faster than I would have believed possible for something that size, and vanished into the trees. For a moment we stood frozen, our minds struggling to process what we had just seen. Then a low moan from Claire snapped us out of it. We rushed to her side. She was alive, but barely. Her clothes were shredded, and her body was covered in deep, vicious-looking gashes. She stared up at us, her eyes glassy with shock and pain. "It came out of nowhere," she whispered, her voice barely audible. I couldn't. Her eyes rolled back in her head and she went limp. For one heart-stopping moment, I thought we'd lost her. But then I saw the shallow rise and fall of her chest. She was still breathing, but she needed medical attention, and fast. We carried her out of those woods, taking turns when our arms grew tired. It was a brutal hike, made all the more difficult by the darkness and our growing fear. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat, every sound made us jump. By the time we reached the trailhead, we were both exhausted, physically and mentally. Hank was there, pacing under the harsh glare of the floodlights. When he saw us, Claire's limp form cradled in Tom's arms, he let out a sound I'll never forget, half sob, half scream. He ran to us, his hands hovering over his wife's still form, afraid to touch her. The next few hours passed in a blur. An ambulance came, whisking Claire away to the hospital. Hank went with her, his face a mask of grief and fear. Tom and I gave our statements to the local police, trying our best to describe what we'd seen without sounding completely insane. I could tell by the looks on their faces that they didn't believe us, not really. But the evidence of the attack on Claire was undeniable. Something had hurt her, something that definitely wasn't human. In the days that followed, a sense of dread settled over Pinecrest. More people went missing, hikers and campers who ventured into the woods and never came out. Search parties were sent out, but they found nothing, no trace of the missing people. It was as if the forest had swallowed them whole. Claire, miraculously, survived her ordeal. But she was changed, and not just physically. She was haunted, jumping at every sound, every unexpected movement. She spoke of the creature in the woods, the thing that had attacked her. but no one believed her. They put it down to trauma, to the stress of her ordeal. Only Tom and I knew the truth. We had seen it with our own eyes. We tried to hunt it, to track it down. We spent days combing the woods, setting traps, following trails that always seemed to lead nowhere. It was like the creature was toying with us, always one step ahead. And with each passing day, the fear in Pinecrest grew. People started locking their doors at night, keeping their children inside. The woods, once a place of beauty and tranquility, became a place of terror. And then just when we thought things couldn't get any worse, they did. We found a body, or what was left of one. It was a hiker, a man named Ethan Boyd. He had been torn apart, his body scattered across a small clearing deep in the woods. It was a scene of unimaginable horror, and it broke something inside me. I knew then that we were dealing with something far beyond our understanding, something evil. The attacks escalated from there. More bodies were found, each one more gruesome than the last. People started leaving Pinecrest, packing up their lives and fleeing in the middle of the night. Those who remained lived in a constant state of terror, jumping at every shadow. The town was dying and we seemed powerless to stop it. And then, one night, the creature came for me. I was at home, trying to catch a few hours of restless sleep, when I heard a sound outside my window. At first I thought it was just the wind, but then I heard it again, a low, guttural growl that seemed to vibrate through my entire body. I grabbed my gun, my hand shaking so badly I could barely load it. I crept to the window, my heart pounding in my ears, and there it was, crouched in the shadows of my yard. Its black eyes seemed to bore into me, and I swear I saw something like amusement in them, as if it knew how terrified I was. I don't know what would have happened if Tom hadn't shown up when he did. He burst into my house, his own gun drawn. Together we managed to drive the creature back into the woods, but I knew it wouldn't be gone for long. It would be back, and it would keep coming back until it got what it wanted. What that was, I didn't know. All I knew was that we had to stop it before it destroyed everything and everyone I cared about. The final confrontation happened deep in the heart of the forest, in a place even the most experienced hikers avoided. Tom and I, along with a handful of the bravest, or perhaps most foolish men and women of Pinecrest, tracked the creature to its lair. It was a place of darkness and death, the ground littered with the bones of its victims. The battle was brutal. The creature was strong, stronger than anything I had ever faced. It moved with a speed and agility that defied belief, and its claws cut through flesh like a knife through butter. We lost good people that day, friends and neighbors, people I had known my entire life. But in the end we prevailed. The creature lay dead at our feet, its black blood staining the earth. But even in death it seemed to mock us, because we never found out what it was or where it had come from. Some said it was a mutation, a product of the toxic waste that had been illegally dumped in the woods years before. Others claimed it was something older, something that had always been there, waiting in the shadows. I didn't know what to believe. All I knew was that it was over, and Pinecrest could start to heal. But for me, there was no healing. The horrors I had seen, the friends I had lost, they haunted me. I left Pinecrest not long after, unable to stay in the place that held so many painful memories. I drifted for a while, trying to find somewhere I belonged, but I never could quite shake the feeling that something was watching me, waiting for me in the darkness, and sometimes, in the deepest part of the night, I swear I can hear it, that low, guttural growl that still sends shivers down my spine. And I wonder, is it really over, or is it still out there somewhere, waiting for its next victim? I pray I never find out, but in my heart I know the truth. Evil like that never really dies, it just waits, biding its time until it can strike again. The manila folder landed on my desk with a dull thud. Inside were photos of mangled livestock, missing person reports, and grainy trail camera footage that showed only shadows. Another assignment, another horror waiting in the wilderness. But this one would be different. This one would be my last. My name is Robert Johnson, and for 15 years I worked for a classified government unit that investigates unexplained phenomena. We operate in the shadows, cleaning up messes that would shatter the public's perception of reality. Most of our work involves debunking hoaxes or explaining away natural phenomena. But sometimes we find something that defies explanation, something that shouldn't exist. The briefing was held in a windowless room deep within a nondescript government building in Washington, D.C. Deputy Director Morrison, a tall woman with steel gray hair and eyes that had seen too much, laid out the situation. Pine Hollow, Maine, population 847. In the past 6 months, 3 hikers have vanished without a trace, 7 cattle mutilations, 2 search and rescue teams reported hearing unusual sounds before their equipment malfunctioned. She paused, letting the information sink in. Local authorities are overwhelmed. The mayor is talking to reporters. We need this contained before it draws national attention. I studied the photos spread across the table. The cattle hadn't been eaten, they'd been torn apart, as if by something testing its strength. The missing hikers were experienced outdoorsmen, not amateur tourists who might have gotten lost. Something was wrong in Pine Hollow, and we were being sent to fix it. Our 4-person team assembled at Bangor International Airport on a humid August afternoon. I'd worked with each of them before, trusted them with my life. Eric Barnes, our technology specialist, was already setting up his equipment in the back of our unmarked SUV. His fingers moved across keyboards with practiced precision, but I noticed they trembled slightly. He'd lost his partner on our last mission in the Ozarks. Lisa Murray, our biologist, was examining satellite maps of the area. Her academic background gave her an air of detachment, but I'd seen her face down things that would send most people running in terror. She'd specialized in predator behavior before joining the unit, though nothing in her studies had prepared her for what we actually hunted. Sam Torres completed our team. Former Marine Force recon, he carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who had seen combat but didn't feel the need to talk about it. He methodically checked our weapons, standard-issue M4 carbines and Sig Sauer sidearms. We never knew what we might encounter, so we came prepared for anything. The drive north took us through increasingly remote territory. Paved roads gave way to gravel, then dirt. Cell service disappeared. The GPS showed only empty spaces between the trees. Pine Hollow wasn't just off the beaten path, it was barely on the map. The town itself was a collection of weathered buildings clustered around a single main street. A few pickup trucks were parked outside the general store, their rust pattern suggesting they'd been there for years. An American flag hung limply from the post office, its colors faded by sun and rain. We checked into the Pine Hollow Inn, a 2-story building that had seen better days. The owner, Mrs. Henderson, was a widow in her 70s, who seemed relieved to have paying customers. "Not many tourists these days," she said, her voice carrying a hint of worry. "Not since the disappearances started." I asked her about the missing hikers. Her face tightened. Good people, knew these woods better than anyone. Whatever took them, she stopped herself, shaking her head. "You be careful out there. The forest, it's different now." We spent the first day interviewing locals and examining the sites where the cattle had been found. The pattern was clear. All the incidents had occurred within a 5-mile radius of an area the locals called the dead zone, where even the hardiest hunters refused to go. Eric's equipment picked up unusual electromagnetic readings. "It's like something's interfering with the natural magnetic field," he said, frowning at his instruments. "I've never seen patterns like this before." Lisa found tracks that didn't match any known species. "The stride length suggests something big," she explained, measuring the distance between prints. "But the impression pattern is all wrong. It's like it's walking on 2 legs, but the weight distribution is impossible for any known bipedal animal." As dusk approached, we made camp near the edge of the dead zone. The forest was unnaturally quiet. No birds, no insects, not even the rustle of small animals in the underbrush. The silence pressed against our ears like a physical presence. The rhythmic thumping started at midnight. At first it was barely noticeable, a low vibration you felt more than heard, but it grew stronger, more insistent, like a massive heart beating beneath the earth. Our equipment began to malfunction, screens flickering with static. "Movement, 200 meters north," Sam whispered, his thermal scope scanning the tree line. But whatever he saw vanished before the rest of us could confirm it. The thumping grew louder, closer. Tree branches swayed without wind. The air became thick, making it difficult to breathe. Then we heard the scream, not human, not animal, but something in between. It echoed through the forest, setting our teeth on edge. Eric's hands flew across his keyboard. "Getting massive electromagnetic spikes. Whatever it is, it's..." His words cut off as something large crashed through the underbrush behind him. In the beam of our flashlights, we caught a glimpse of dark fur, gleaming eyes, and teeth that seemed too numerous, too sharp. The attack was swift and brutal. Eric never had a chance to run. The creature moved with impossible speed, its massive form defying physics. One moment Eric was there, the next he was gone, leaving only a spray of blood across his equipment. The next 24 hours became a desperate game of survival. We abandoned most of our gear, taking only weapons and essential supplies. The creature toyed with us, herding us deeper into its territory. We'd hear the thumping from one direction, only to have it suddenly appear behind us. Lisa tried to analyze its behavior. "It's intelligent," she said as we took shelter in a ravine. "It's not just hunting us, it's studying us, learning our patterns." Her scientific detachment was cracking, fear showing through the professional facade. Sam's military training kept us alive through the second night. He set up defensive positions, laid false trails, did everything by the book, but the creature didn't play by any rules we understood. It came for him during his watch, moving so fast our bullets seemed to pass right through it. His last words were a warning: "Run." Then the darkness took him, his screams mixing with the sound of breaking bones. We found the cabin just before dawn, an old ranger station, long abandoned. Lisa's hands shook as she helped me barricade the doors and windows. We were running on adrenaline and fear, our minds struggling to process what we'd seen. "What is it?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Nothing moves like that. Nothing should be that strong." I had no answers. In 15 years of hunting monsters, I'd never encountered anything like this. The reports, the photos, nothing had prepared us for the reality of what stalked these woods. The creature came for us as the sun set. The thumping grew until the whole cabin shook, dust falling from the ceiling. Lisa fired through a window, the muzzle flash illuminating a shape that seemed to shift and change in the darkness. The thing that burst through the wall was nightmare-made flesh. Its fur absorbed light, its eyes held an intelligence that was terrifying in its alienness. Lisa's bullets struck it, drawing blood that seemed to evaporate before it hit the ground. I fought with everything I had, but it was like fighting a force of nature. The creature threw me across the room with casual strength. Through blurred vision, I saw it take Lisa. Her screams faded into the forest, leaving me alone with the knowledge that I had failed to protect my team. The official report lists it as a bear attack. 3 federal agents killed in the line of duty while investigating wildlife disturbances. My testimony was quietly buried, along with any evidence that might suggest something more sinister. I left the unit after that. Opened a small bookstore in Vermont, surrounded myself with stories that make sense, that have beginnings and endings, but the memories of Pine Hollow haunt me. Sometimes, late at night, I hear a familiar thumping in the distance. The locals here tell stories about missing hikers, about strange sounds in the woods. I wonder if it followed me, if it's still out there, watching, waiting, or maybe there are more of them, spreading slowly across the dark places of our world. The thought keeps me awake at night, staring at the ceiling, remembering the look in its eyes, ancient, hungry, and terrifyingly aware. The government still sends teams to investigate strange occurrences in remote places. I've heard whispers of similar incidents in other forests, other small towns, but I won't go back. I've seen what lurks in the shadows, and I know that some mysteries are better left unsolved. Yet sometimes, when the wind blows through the trees and the shadows grow long, I find myself reaching for my old gear, checking my weapons. Because deep down I know the truth. The creature of Pine Hollow is still out there, and one day it might come looking for the one who got away. The incident occurred in the summer of 2018. I was 31 then, and my boyfriend James was 33. We had been dating for 3 years, and this was meant to be our first romantic getaway to my family's cabin in northwestern Ontario. The timing couldn't have been more perfect. We had both managed to secure the same week off from our demanding jobs in Toronto, a rare occurrence that we decided to celebrate with a retreat to the wilderness. The cabin sits on a small island in Lake Mistral, roughly 45 minutes by winding gravel road from the nearest town of Thornbury. The property has been in my family for over 60 years, passed down from my grandfather, who built it himself in 1958, 23 cabins dot the shoreline of the lake, but they're spread so far apart that you can barely see your neighbors through the thick wall of pine, spruce, and birch trees that surround the water. The drive north was peaceful enough. James had never been this far into the Canadian wilderness, and I found myself playing tour guide, pointing out landmarks and sharing childhood memories. But as we turned onto the final stretch of road leading to the boat launch, I noticed something that made my stomach tighten. The usual summer bustle was absent. The parking area that should have been dotted with vehicles was nearly empty, just 2 dusty pickup trucks and a rusted sedan that looked like it hadn't moved in weeks. "Where is everyone?" James asked, voicing my own concern. "It's Wednesday," I replied, though I wasn't entirely convinced by my own explanation. "Most people only come up on weekends." The boat launch itself felt wrong. The wooden dock, weathered gray by decades of harsh winters, creaked ominously under our feet as we loaded our supplies into the aluminum boat. The water was unusually still, like black glass reflecting the overcast sky. Not even the slightest ripple disturbed the surface, and the silence was so complete it felt oppressive. As I pulled the engine's starter cord, the motor's roar seemed to echo endlessly across the water, bouncing off the surrounding hills with an intensity that made both of us wince. The sound felt like an intrusion, a violation of something sacred and untouched. James gripped the sides of the boat as I navigated through the narrow channel between 2 small islands, his knuckles white against the worn aluminum. "God, it's quiet out here," he muttered, his voice barely audible over the engine. I nodded, but something deeper was bothering me. In all my years coming to this lake, I had never experienced this level of emptiness. There should have been loons calling, fish jumping, the distant sound of other boats. Instead, there was nothing but the mechanical drone of our engine and the gentle lap of water against the hull. The island came into view as we rounded the final bend. Our cabin, a modest A-frame structure with a wraparound deck, sat perched on a small hill overlooking the water. It should have been a welcoming sight, but something about its dark windows and motionless surroundings made it appear almost abandoned. The dock, usually sun-bleached and warm, looked gray and uninviting in the dim afternoon light. As we tied up the boat and began unloading our gear, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being observed. The tree line, thick with decades of growth, seemed to press closer to the cabin than I remembered. Dark gaps between the trunks created pockets of shadow so deep they appeared solid, impenetrable. I found myself glancing repeatedly at these spaces, expecting to see movement, but finding only more darkness. "You okay?" James asked, noticing my distraction. "Just tired from the drive," I lied, shouldering my backpack and heading up the steep path to the cabin. The key was hidden in its usual spot under the loose board on the deck. As I unlocked the door and stepped inside, the musty smell of a building that had been closed up for months hit me immediately. It was a familiar scent, a mixture of old wood, lake air, and the faint smokiness that never quite left the stone fireplace. But underneath these expected odors there was something else, something organic and unsettling that I couldn't quite identify. James appeared behind me, arms loaded with supplies. "Smells like my grandmother's attic," he said with a nervous laugh. I forced a smile and opened the windows to let in fresh air, but the breeze that entered felt cold despite the warm afternoon temperature. As I worked to air out the cabin, I noticed several things that struck me as odd. There were scratches on the windowsill of the main room that I didn't remember from previous visits, long parallel marks that looked almost like claw marks. The screen door had a tear in it that definitely wasn't there last season. Most disturbing of all, there were what appeared to be large footprints in the soft earth around the cabin's foundation, though they were too weathered to make out any distinct details. Probably just a bear, I told myself, but the prints seemed too large, too human-like in their stride pattern. We spent the rest of the afternoon settling in, unpacking our clothes, and preparing dinner. James seemed to relax as we fell into the routine of cabin life, but I remained on edge. Every creak of the old building, every rustle of leaves outside, every distant sound from the lake made me pause and listen. The isolation, that had always been one of my favorite aspects of this place, now felt threatening. As evening approached, the temperature dropped significantly. This was unusual for July, but I convinced myself it was just a cold front moving through. We built a fire in the stone fireplace and settled in for our first night, playing cards and sharing stories. James seemed genuinely happy, and I tried to mirror his mood, but I couldn't stop glancing at the dark windows. Around 11 o'clock, as we were preparing for bed, I heard it for the first time. A low, guttural sound that seemed to come from somewhere deep in the woods. It lasted only a few seconds, but it was unlike anything I had ever heard before. Not quite an animal sound, but not human either. Something in between. "What was that?" James asked, his card game forgotten. "Probably just a loon," I said quickly, though I knew it wasn't. Loons have a distinctive call that I had grown up hearing. This was something else entirely. We finished our game in relative silence, both of us straining to hear any repetition of the sound. When none came, we convinced ourselves it had been our imagination, or perhaps a distant truck on the mainland road. But as we settled into our beds in the back room, I found myself lying awake, listening to every sound the night offered. The cabin fell silent, except for the gentle lapping of water against the dock and the occasional creak of settling wood. James's breathing soon deepened into the steady rhythm of sleep, but rest would not come for me. Something was wrong with this place, something that went beyond the usual isolation and wilderness sounds I had grown accustomed to over the years. Outside, the darkness seemed absolute. Even with my eyes adjusted to the gloom, I could see nothing beyond the bedroom window. The blackness was so complete it felt solid, as if someone had hung a thick curtain just inches from the glass. I lay there for what felt like hours, my ears straining for any sound that might explain the growing dread that had settled in my chest. It was nearly 2 in the morning when I finally drifted off to sleep, but my dreams were filled with images of shapes moving through the trees, of eyes watching from the darkness, and of that strange, impossible sound echoing endlessly through the forest. Thursday morning arrived gray and humid, with low clouds hanging over the lake like a wet blanket. I woke feeling unrested, my body aching as if I had been running all night. James was already up, standing at the kitchen window with a cup of coffee, looking out at the water. "Sleep well?" he asked, though something in his voice suggested he already knew the answer. "Not really," I admitted, joining him at the window. "You?" "I kept hearing things," he said quietly. "Probably just the wind, but—" He didn't finish the sentence, but he didn't need to. I had heard them too. Soft sounds that might have been footsteps circling the cabin, the creak of the deckboards as if someone was testing each one carefully, the whisper of something moving through the tall grass that surrounded our clearing. The lake appeared different in the morning light. The water, which had been mirror smooth the evening before, now showed signs of disturbance. Concentric circles rippled outward from various points, as if large objects had recently broken the surface. But there were no fish jumping, no ducks or other waterfowl that might explain the disturbance. "Maybe we should head back to town today," James suggested, his usual enthusiasm for outdoor adventures notably absent. I considered this seriously. Everything about this trip felt wrong, from the empty lake to the strange sounds to the growing sense that we were not alone on the island. But I had been looking forward to this getaway for months, and the rational part of my mind insisted that we were simply letting our imaginations run wild. "Let's give it one more day," I said finally. "If we still feel weird about it tonight, we can leave in the morning." James nodded, but I could see the reluctance in his eyes. We decided to spend the day exploring the island, hoping that daylight and activity would dispel the unease that had settled over us. After breakfast, we packed a small lunch and set out on the network of overgrown trails that crisscrossed the island. The paths, which I had hiked countless times as a child, felt different now. Narrower somehow, more enclosed. The trees seemed to lean inward, their branches creating a canopy so thick that little sunlight reached the forest floor. The usual sounds of woodland life, bird songs, the chatter of squirrels, the rustle of small creatures in the underbrush, were absent. It was as if the entire ecosystem had gone into hiding. 20 minutes into our hike, we came across the first sign that we were not alone. Pressed into a patch of soft earth beside the trail was a footprint unlike anything I had ever seen. It was roughly the size and shape of a human foot, but longer and wider, with what appeared to be claw marks at the tips of the toes. The print was fresh, probably made within the last day or two. "Bear?" James asked, though his voice lacked conviction. I knelt down for a closer look, comparing the print to my own foot. It was at least twice as large and showed a stride pattern that suggested bipedal movement. Bears occasionally walk on their hind legs, but this print was too human-like for that explanation to satisfy me. "I don't think so," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. We found 3 more prints over the next 100 yards, each one clearer than the last. The final print was so detailed that I could make out individual toe marks and what appeared to be a heel impression. Whatever had made these tracks was heavy, probably weighing well over 200 pounds, and it had been moving deliberately along the same path we were now following. The trail led us to the highest point on the island, a rocky outcrop that offered a view of the entire lake and the surrounding forest. From this vantage point, we could see the other cabins scattered around the shoreline, but not a single one showed signs of occupancy. No boats at the docks, no lights in the windows, no smoke from chimneys. The entire lake appeared to be deserted except for us. "This is wrong," James said, voicing what we were both thinking. "Where is everyone?" I had no answer. In all my years coming to this lake, I had never seen it so completely empty. Even during the off-season, there were usually a few year-round residents who maintained their properties. The absence of any human activity felt ominous, as if everyone else knew something we didn't. We ate our lunch in silence, both of us scanning the tree line for any sign of movement. The forest remained still, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Several times I caught glimpses of what might have been a large shape moving between the trees, but each time I looked directly at the spot, there was nothing there. "We should go back," I said finally, the words coming out more forcefully than I had intended. James didn't argue. We packed up our remaining food and began the descent back to the cabin, but as we walked, I became increasingly aware that we were not alone on the trail. Behind us, perhaps 50 yards back, something was following. I could hear the soft pad of footsteps that seemed to match our pace, stopping when we stopped, resuming when we continued. I grabbed James's arm and whispered, "Don't look back, but I think something is following us." His body tensed, and I could see him fighting the urge to turn around. We increased our pace, but the footsteps behind us quickened as well. Whatever was back there was making no effort to hide its presence now. The sounds were deliberate, almost taunting. When we reached the cabin, we both ran the last 50 yards, not stopping until we were safely inside with the door locked behind us. Only then did we risk looking back toward the trail. The forest edge was empty, but the grass leading to the tree line was disturbed, as if something large had recently passed through it. "What do you think it was?" James asked, his face pale. I didn't answer because I didn't want to voice the terrifying possibility that was forming in my mind. Whatever had been following us was not a bear or any other animal I was familiar with. It was something else, something that moved with intelligence and purpose, something that understood it was hunting us. We spent the rest of the afternoon inside the cabin, periodically checking the windows for any sign of movement in the tree line. The silence outside was complete, more oppressive than any sound could have been. It felt like the calm before a storm, a held breath before something terrible happened. As evening approached, I began to consider James's earlier suggestion that we leave. Every instinct I possessed was screaming at me to get off this island, to put as much distance as possible between us and whatever was lurking in those woods. But the boat was tied up at the dock, and the idea of walking down that exposed path in the growing darkness felt even more terrifying than staying put. "We'll leave first thing in the morning," I promised James and myself, "as soon as there's enough light to navigate safely." But as the sun set and darkness began to creep across the lake, I had a sinking feeling that morning might be too late. Despite our growing unease, we decided to venture to the mainland the next day. The boat ride across the lake felt different from our arrival. The water, which had been glass smooth, now showed an odd choppiness despite the absence of wind. James handled the motor while I sat in the bow, constantly scanning the shoreline for any sign of movement. "Look at that," James called out, pointing to a stretch of beach near the boat launch. Long gouges in the sand led from the water's edge into the tree line, as if something massive had been dragged from the lake. The marks were too large and too deliberate to be natural, and they appeared fresh. Whatever had made them had done so recently, possibly during the night while we had been trying to sleep. We tied up the boat at the mainland dock with unusual care, making sure it was secure enough to withstand any disturbance. The parking area, which had been nearly empty when we arrived, was now completely deserted. The 2 pickup trucks and rusted sedan were gone, leaving only oil stains and tire tracks in the gravel. "Where did everyone go?" James asked, his voice tight with anxiety. I had no answer. It was as if the entire area had been evacuated while we slept. The absence of other people felt wrong, unnatural. Even the most remote locations usually showed some signs of human presence. Tire tracks, cigarette butts, discarded food wrappers. Here, there was nothing. We found the old logging road about half a mile from the boat launch, just as I remembered it from childhood visits. The entrance was partially blocked by a rusted gate that hung open on broken hinges. A weathered sign warned that the road was closed to vehicular traffic, but it said nothing about foot traffic. The road itself was in worse condition than I remembered. What had once been a gravel surface was now largely overgrown with weeds and small saplings. Deep ruts filled with stagnant water created obstacles every few hundred yards. The forest pressed in on both sides, creating a tunnel effect that blocked out most of the sky. "Are you sure this is safe?" James asked as we began our hike. "I used to come here as a kid," I replied, though I wasn't entirely convinced by my own words. "It's just an old logging road. People use it for berry picking." But as we walked deeper into the woods, I began to question my childhood memories. The road seemed to stretch much further than I remembered, and the forest on either side appeared denser, more impenetrable. The usual sounds of wildlife were absent, replaced by an oppressive silence that made our footsteps seem unnaturally loud. After an hour of hiking, we came across the first sign that we were not alone. A massive tree had fallen across the road, its trunk easily 4 feet in diameter. But this wasn't natural deadfall. The tree showed clear signs of having been deliberately pushed over. The root system was intact, and the trunk had been positioned in a way that completely blocked the path. "Storm damage?" James suggested, though his voice lacked conviction. I examined the tree more closely. There were no other signs of storm activity. No broken branches, no debris, no damage to the surrounding trees. This single tree had been toppled with surgical precision, as if someone or something had wanted to block access to the road. We managed to climb over the fallen trunk and continue our hike, but the incident had shaken both of us. The road beyond the tree was in even worse condition, with deep gouges in the earth that looked like they had been made by something heavy being dragged along the ground. 2 hours into our hike, we found a small clearing where we decided to stop for lunch. The space was roughly circular, surrounded by towering pines that blocked out most of the sky. In the center of the clearing was a ring of blackened stones that had obviously been used as a fire pit, though it looked like it hadn't been active for years. As we ate our sandwiches, I noticed something that made my blood freeze. Around the perimeter of the clearing, scratched into the bark of several trees, were marks that looked almost like symbols. They were too regular and deliberate to be natural, but they weren't quite recognizable as letters or numbers either. They had been carved deep into the wood, requiring considerable force and time. "James," I whispered, pointing to the nearest tree. He followed my gaze and went pale. "What do you think they mean?" "I don't know," I admitted, but the symbols filled me with a dread that I couldn't explain. They looked ancient, primitive, like some form of territorial marking or warning. We finished our lunch quickly and decided to turn back. The road ahead disappeared into thick forest, and neither of us felt comfortable venturing further into the unknown. But as we prepared to leave the clearing, I heard something that made my heart race. From somewhere deep in the woods, beyond the range of our vision, came a sound unlike anything I had ever heard. It started as a low rumble, almost like a growl, but it gradually rose in pitch until it became a howl that seemed to echo from multiple directions at once. The sound was neither fully animal nor human, but something in between, something that spoke of intelligence and malice. "What was that?" James whispered, his face drained of color. I didn't answer because I didn't know, and I was afraid that any sound might attract whatever had made that terrible noise. We stood frozen in the clearing, listening as the howl faded into silence. But the quiet that followed was worse than the sound itself. It was the silence of a predator that had located its prey. When we finally found the courage to move, we discovered that we were being followed. Behind us, perhaps 100 yards back, branches were snapping and leaves were rustling as something large moved through the underbrush. Whatever it was made no effort to hide its presence. If anything, it seemed to be announcing itself, letting us know that it was there. We quickened our pace, but the sounds behind us matched our speed. When we jogged, it jogged. When we slowed down, it slowed down. It was toying with us, demonstrating that it could catch us whenever it chose to do so. "Don't look back," I whispered to James, though I was fighting the same urge. "Just keep walking." But the temptation was overwhelming. As we reached the fallen tree that blocked the road, I couldn't resist a quick glance over my shoulder. What I saw made my legs go weak. Standing at the edge of the clearing we had just left was a shape that defied easy description. It was tall, at least 7 feet, and covered in dark hair or fur. But it stood upright like a human, and its eyes, God, its eyes, reflected the dim forest light like mirrors. For a moment, those eyes locked with mine, and I saw something there that was far more terrifying than any wild animal. I saw intelligence, calculation, and something that looked disturbingly like amusement. "Run," I whispered to James, and we both scrambled over the fallen tree and began sprinting down the road. Behind us, the creature let out another of those terrible howls, but this time it was closer, much closer. We ran harder than I had ever run in my life, our feet pounding against the broken pavement as branches whipped at our faces and arms. The sounds of pursuit grew louder, not just footsteps now, but the crash of something large moving through the forest parallel to the road. We didn't stop running until we reached the boat launch, and even then, we only paused long enough to untie the boat and push off from the dock. As James yanked the starter cord, I looked back at the tree line and saw movement in the shadows. Whatever had been following us was still there, watching from the safety of the forest. The boat engine roared to life, and we sped across the lake toward our island sanctuary. But as we reached the middle of the water, I realized with growing horror that we might not be heading toward safety at all. We might be heading toward a trap. The boat ride back to the island felt like an eternity. Every shadow on the water's surface looked like something moving beneath us, and I found myself constantly checking behind us to make sure we weren't being followed. The forest on both sides of the lake seemed to press closer, creating the illusion that the water was narrowing, funneling us toward some predetermined destination. James's hand shook as he steered the boat, and I could see the terror in his eyes. Neither of us spoke about what we had seen on the logging road. The creature, for lack of a better word, had been too impossible, too outside the realm of normal experience to discuss rationally. But it had been real. We had both seen it, and we both knew that it had been following us. As we approached our island, I noticed immediately that something was wrong. The cabin, which we had left with all the windows closed and doors locked, now showed signs of disturbance. The screen door hung partially open, moving gently in the breeze. One of the bedroom windows was open, though I was certain we had secured it before leaving. "Did we leave that window open?" James asked, his voice barely audible over the engine noise. "No," I replied, feeling my stomach drop. "We closed everything." We tied up the boat with unusual care, both of us reluctant to leave the relative safety of the water. The dock, which had felt solid and welcoming when we first arrived, now seemed exposed and vulnerable. The wooden planks creaked ominously under our feet, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched from the tree line. The path up to the cabin had been disturbed. Large footprints, the same ones we had seen on the logging road, were pressed into the soft earth, leading from the water's edge directly to our front door. But these prints were different from the ones we had found earlier. These were deeper, more deliberate, as if whatever had made them had been carrying something heavy. "It was here," James whispered, staring at the footprints. "While we were gone, it was here." I nodded, unable to speak. The implications were terrifying. Whatever that creature was, it had intelligence enough to know that we had left the island. It had used our absence to explore our temporary home, to learn about us, to perhaps prepare for our return. We approached the cabin with extreme caution, James grabbing a heavy piece of driftwood from the shore to use as a weapon. The front door was still locked, but the frame showed scratches where something had tested the strength of the wood. The screen door's mesh was torn in several places, as if large claws had raked across it. Inside, the cabin looked largely undisturbed, but there were subtle signs that someone or something had been there. A chair had been moved slightly. Cabinet doors that we had left closed were now ajar. Most disturbing of all, there was a smell. The same organic, unsettling odor I had detected when we first arrived, but now it was stronger, more concentrated. "We need to leave," James said, his voice tight with fear. "Right now." I wanted to agree, but the sun was already beginning to set. and the idea of navigating the lake in darkness felt even more dangerous than staying put. The creature had demonstrated that it could move through the forest as easily as we could move through our own home. If it could reach this island, it could certainly reach the mainland. "We'll leave first thing in the morning," I promised, "as soon as there's enough light." But as darkness fell over the lake, I began to question whether we would survive the night. The creature had been in our cabin. It knew where we slept, where we ate, where we felt safest. It had studied us, learned our routines, prepared for whatever it planned to do next. We barricaded the doors with furniture and checked every window to ensure they were locked. The bedroom window, the one that had been mysteriously opened, showed scratches on the sill that looked like they had been made by claws. Something had been trying to get in, or perhaps had already been inside and was trying to get out. "Maybe we should take turns keeping watch," James suggested. I agreed, though I doubted either of us would be able to sleep. The cabin, which had always been my sanctuary, now felt like a trap. The walls that had once provided security now seemed thin and vulnerable. Every creak of the old building, every gust of wind against the windows, every distant sound from the lake made us both freeze and listen. Around 10 o'clock, as we sat in the main room with all the lights on, we heard the first sound from outside. It was a scratching noise, like claws being dragged across wood. The sound moved slowly around the perimeter of the cabin, as if something was testing each wall, each window, each potential entry point. "It's circling the cabin," James whispered, his face pale in the lamplight. I nodded, too terrified to speak. The scratching continued for nearly an hour, sometimes stopping directly outside a window, sometimes moving to the deck where the footsteps were clearly audible on the wooden planks. Whatever was out there was taking its time, studying the building, learning its weaknesses. Then, suddenly, the sound stopped. The silence that followed was worse than any noise could have been. We sat frozen, straining to hear any indication of where the creature had gone. Minutes passed, then hours. But the quiet persisted, so complete that it felt unnatural. "Maybe it's gone," James said hopefully. I wanted to believe him, but something told me that the creature was still there, still watching, still waiting. It had learned patience, had developed a strategy. It was no longer simply following us, it was hunting us. At midnight, we heard the first sounds from the roof. Heavy footsteps moved across the metal surface, each step deliberate and careful. The creature was directly above us, separated only by a few inches of wood and insulation. I could hear it moving from one end of the cabin to the other, as if it was mapping the layout from above. "God help us," James whispered. The footsteps stopped directly over the bedroom where we would normally be sleeping. Something heavy settled onto the roof, and we could hear a scraping sound as if the creature was using its claws to test the strength of the metal. For several minutes, it remained motionless, and I had the terrifying thought that it might be listening to us, learning our location by the sound of our breathing. Then, without warning, the footsteps resumed, moving toward the edge of the roof. We heard the creature descend, not down a ladder or along the walls, but in a single leap that shook the entire cabin. It had jumped from the roof to the ground, a distance of at least 12 feet, and landed with the grace of something that had made similar leaps countless times before. The silence that followed was absolute. We waited, barely breathing, for any sound that might indicate where the creature had gone, but there was nothing. It had vanished as quickly as it had appeared, leaving us alone with our terror and the growing certainty that it would return. We spent the rest of the night huddled together on the couch, taking turns at fitful sleep while the other kept watch. But dawn felt like it would never come, and I began to wonder if we would live to see another sunrise. Dawn arrived gray and cold, with a thick mist rising from the lake that reduced visibility to barely 50 feet. The fog seemed to cling to the island, creating an otherworldly atmosphere that made familiar landmarks appear strange and threatening. James and I had managed perhaps 2 hours of sleep between us, and we both looked haggard and exhausted. "We're leaving as soon as this fog lifts," I announced, though my voice lacked conviction. James nodded, but we both knew that the mist showed no signs of dissipating. If anything, it seemed to be growing thicker, as if the lake itself was conspiring to keep us trapped on the island. The water was invisible beyond the dock, and the mainland had disappeared entirely behind the gray veil. We spent the morning preparing for our departure, packing our belongings and securing the cabin. But as we worked, I became increasingly aware that we were being watched. The fog provided perfect camouflage for whatever was out there, and I caught glimpses of movement in the white curtain that surrounded us. "There," James whispered, pointing toward the tree line. "Did you see that?" I looked but saw only shifting mist and shadows, but I trusted his instincts. We had both developed a heightened awareness of our surroundings that bordered on the supernatural. Something was out there, moving through the fog, circling our position like a predator sizing up its prey. The boat sat at the dock like a lifeline, but the idea of navigating the lake in zero visibility was terrifying. We could easily become lost, run aground, or worse, encounter whatever was hunting us in the open water where we would have no chance of escape. We wait for the fog to clear, I decided. We don't have a choice. But as the morning progressed, it became clear that the mist was not natural. It maintained a consistent thickness and showed no signs of being affected by the breeze or the warming sun. We were trapped, and whatever was out there knew it. The first direct confrontation came around noon. I was standing at the kitchen window, watching the fog for any sign of movement, when a massive shape materialized just beyond the glass. For a moment, I found myself face to face with the creature, separated only by a thin pane of glass and a few inches of space. It was even more terrifying up close. The face was vaguely human but distorted, with features that seemed to shift and change as I watched. The eyes were dark and intelligent, filled with a malevolence that made my blood freeze. But it was the expression on that face that truly terrified me. It was smiling, as if it knew something I didn't, as if it was enjoying my fear. "James," I whispered, but I couldn't look away from those eyes. The creature raised one massive hand and pressed it against the glass. The fingers were long and clawed, easily capable of punching through the window if it chose to do so, but it didn't break the glass. Instead, it simply stood there watching me, letting me know that it could reach me whenever it decided to. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the creature melted back into the fog, but its handprint remained on the glass, a dark smudge that looked disturbingly like blood. "It's playing with us," James said, his voice barely audible. "It could have broken in, but it didn't. It's enjoying this." I nodded, unable to speak. The creature wasn't just hunting us. It was tormenting us, drawing out our terror for its own amusement. We were trapped in a game where we didn't know the rules, and our opponent held all the advantages. The afternoon brought more encounters. Shapes moved through the fog around the cabin, sometimes approaching the windows, sometimes testing the doors. We could hear heavy breathing outside, the sound of claws scraping against wood, the occasional low rumble that might have been laughter. "Why doesn't it just attack?" James asked during one of the longer quiet periods. I had been wondering the same thing. The creature was clearly capable of breaking into the cabin. It had already demonstrated that it could move across the roof and leap from incredible heights. But it seemed to prefer psychological warfare to direct confrontation. "Maybe it's waiting for something," I suggested. "Maybe it has a plan." As if responding to my words, the sounds outside suddenly intensified. Heavy footsteps circled the cabin, but now they were accompanied by what sounded like multiple creatures. The fog seemed to be alive with movement, shapes shifting and darting just beyond the range of our vision. "There's more than one," James whispered, his face pale with terror. I pressed my ear to the wall and listened. He was right. There were at least 3, possibly more, moving through the mist around our shelter. They were coordinating their movements, working together like a pack of predators. We weren't just being hunted by one creature, we were being hunted by a group. The siege continued throughout the afternoon. The creatures took turns approaching the cabin, testing our defenses, probing for weaknesses. They scratched at the walls, rattled the windows, and climbed onto the roof where they moved around with deliberate, calculated steps. But they never tried to break in. They seemed content to wait, to let our fear build, to watch us slowly collapse under the psychological pressure. It was a strategy that was working. Both James and I were near our breaking point, jumping at every sound, seeing threats in every shadow. As evening approached, the fog began to thin slightly, revealing glimpses of the lake beyond. For a moment, I felt a surge of hope. If the mist cleared, we might have a chance to escape. But then I saw them, dark shapes moving through the water, swimming in formation around the island. "They're in the water too," I told James, pointing toward the lake. We were completely surrounded. The creatures had cut off every possible escape route, trapping us on the island until they decided to end their game. The boat, which had represented our only hope of escape, was now unreachable. Even if we could fight our way to the dock, there was no guarantee that we could outrun the creatures in the water. Night fell with agonizing slowness, and with it came the realization that we might not survive until morning. The creatures had been patient during the day, but darkness would give them additional advantages. They could move unseen, coordinate their attacks, and pick us off whenever they chose. "We need a plan," James said, his voice hollow with exhaustion. I nodded, but I had no idea what we could do. We were outnumbered, outmatched, and completely cut off from help. The creatures had demonstrated intelligence, patience, and a level of coordination that suggested they had done this before. We were not their first victims, and we wouldn't be their last. As the final light faded from the sky, I heard something that made my heart stop. From somewhere in the fog, carried on the still air, came the sound of voices. Not animal growls or howls, but actual voices. Low, guttural, and speaking in a language I didn't recognize. The creatures were communicating with each other, planning their next move. And as I listened to those alien voices in the darkness, I realized that we were about to discover exactly what they had been waiting for. The voices in the fog grew louder as full darkness settled over the lake. What I had initially taken for animal sounds were actually words, guttural, primitive, but undeniably intelligent communication. The creatures were discussing us, debating our fate in a language that sounded like it hadn't been spoken by human tongues for thousands of years. "They're talking about us," James whispered, his face pressed against the living room window. I joined him, straining to understand the alien syllables that drifted through the mist. The voices came from multiple directions, suggesting that the creatures had positioned themselves around the cabin in a deliberate formation. They were no longer simply hunting us. They were conducting some kind of ritual, following a protocol that had been established long before we arrived on this island. The first test came just after midnight. A heavy thud against the front door made us both jump, followed by the sound of claws scraping against wood. But instead of trying to break through, the creature seemed to be carving something into the door's surface. The scraping continued for several minutes, creating a pattern that was too regular to be random. "It's marking the door," I realized. Like a symbol. James grabbed a flashlight and crept toward the entrance. Through the small window beside the door, he could see the creature's massive form hunched over its work. It was using its claws with surgical precision, creating deep gouges in the wood that formed a crude but recognizable pattern. "It looks like..." James paused, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. "It looks like a map." I moved closer to look. The creature had carved a rough outline of the island, complete with the cabin's location and what appeared to be markers indicating the positions of the other creatures. But most disturbing were the symbols carved around the perimeter, symbols that looked exactly like the ones we had seen on the trees along the logging road. "They've been planning this," I said, the realization hitting me like a physical blow. The symbols in the forest, the empty lake, the fog, it's all connected. The creature finished its carving and moved away from the door, but not before pressing its face against the window. In the beam of James's flashlight, I could see its features clearly for the first time. It was humanoid but wrong, as if evolution had taken a different path. The skull was elongated, the jaw too large, the eyes set too far apart. But it was the expression that terrified me most. It was looking at us with what could only be described as anticipation. Over the next hour, each of the creatures took turns approaching the cabin. They carved symbols into the walls, scratched patterns into the window frames, and left what appeared to be offerings on the deck, bones, stones, and other objects that I didn't want to examine too closely. They were preparing for something, following a ritual that had been performed before. "We're part of their ceremony," I told James. "We're not just prey. We're participants in something bigger." The thought made my skin crawl. These creatures hadn't simply wandered onto the island by accident. They had been waiting for us, or for people like us. The empty lake, the abandoned cabins, the mysterious disappearance of the other visitors. It all made sense now. We weren't their first victims. We were simply the latest in a long line of people who had been drawn to this place to serve some unknown purpose. Around 2 in the morning, the voices outside began to change. The guttural communication was replaced by something that sounded almost like singing, a low, rhythmic chanting that seemed to come from all directions at once. The fog began to glow with an eerie phosphorescence, creating ghostly shapes that danced around the cabin. "They're summoning something," James said, his voice barely audible. I nodded, though I didn't want to believe it. The chanting grew louder, more insistent, and with it came a sound that made my blood freeze, the splash of something large entering the water. Not one creature, but many, moving through the lake with purpose and intelligence. Through the bedroom window, I could see shapes moving in the illuminated fog. They were tall, humanoid figures that seemed to glide rather than walk. But these weren't the same creatures that had been stalking us. These were different, older, more alien, with a presence that made the air itself feel thick and oppressive. "We need to get out of here," I whispered, though I knew it was impossible. The chanting reached a crescendo, and suddenly the entire cabin was surrounded by the new arrivals. They moved with a fluid grace that was hypnotic and terrifying, their forms shifting and changing as they circled our shelter. The original creatures, the ones that had been hunting us, seemed to step back, showing deference to these new entities. Then, without warning, the chanting stopped. The silence that followed was absolute, more oppressive than any sound could have been. The fog began to dissipate, revealing the full extent of our situation. We were surrounded by dozens of creatures, all standing motionless in the pale light that seemed to emanate from their bodies. "They're waiting for something," James observed. I was about to agree when I heard it, a sound that made my heart stop. From somewhere in the distance, carried across the water, came the unmistakable sound of a boat engine. Someone was approaching the island, heading directly into the trap that had been set for us. "Oh God," I whispered, "there's someone else out there." The creatures heard it too. Their heads turned in unison toward the sound, and I could see the anticipation in their movements. They had been waiting for this moment, this completion of their ritual. We weren't their only targets. We were bait, used to draw others into their web. The boat grew closer, its engine echoing across the water. In the pale light, I could see it cutting through the fog, heading directly for our dock. The pilot couldn't possibly see the creatures waiting on the shore, couldn't know that they were sailing into a carefully orchestrated trap. "We have to warn them," I said, moving toward the door. James grabbed my arm. "We can't. We'll be killed the moment we step outside." He was right, but I couldn't stand by and watch innocent people sail into the same nightmare we were experiencing. I moved to the window and began flashing the lights, trying to signal the approaching boat. But the pilot either didn't see the warning or didn't understand its meaning. The boat continued its approach, the engine growing louder with each passing second. The creatures on the shore began to move, positioning themselves along the dock and the water's edge. They were preparing for the arrival of new victims, ready to begin the next phase of their terrible ritual. And there was nothing we could do to stop them. As the boat's headlight pierced the fog, illuminating the dock where the creatures waited, I realized that we were about to witness something that would haunt us for the rest of our lives, however long that might be. The boat's engine cut out just as it reached the dock, the sudden silence almost deafening after hours of mechanical noise. In the pale phosphorescent light that emanated from the creatures, I could see 2 figures in the boat, a man and a woman, both appearing to be in their 50s. They were laughing about something, completely oblivious to the dozens of entities watching them from the shadows. "We have to do something," I whispered to James, but we both knew there was nothing we could do without exposing ourselves to the same fate. The creatures remained motionless as the couple tied up their boat and began unloading what appeared to be camping gear. They moved with the casual confidence of people who had made this trip many times before, clearly familiar with the area. I wondered briefly if they were the owners of one of the other cabins, returning to check on their property. "Beautiful night for a boat ride," the woman said, her voice carrying clearly across the water. "The fog makes everything look so mysterious." Her companion chuckled as he shouldered a large backpack. "Mystery is good, gets the blood pumping." I wanted to scream at them to run, to get back in their boat and flee while they still could. But I knew that any sound from the cabin would only draw the creature's attention to us. We were forced to watch in helpless terror as the two visitors walked directly into the trap. The first creature moved when the couple was halfway up the path to the cabin. It emerged from the tree line with fluid grace, cutting off their retreat to the dock. The man noticed it first, stopping so suddenly that his companion bumped into him. "What the hell is that?" he said, his voice no longer casual. The woman followed his gaze and went rigid. "That's not possible, that's not—" Her words were cut off as more creatures emerged from the fog. They formed a loose circle around the couple, moving with the same coordinated precision they had shown while stalking us. The man and woman pressed back to back, turning slowly to keep all the creatures in view. "Run," the woman whispered, though there was nowhere to go. The creatures began to close in, their movements deliberate and unhurried. They had done this before, had perfected their technique over years or perhaps decades of practice. The couple was trapped just as surely as we were, caught in a web that had been laid long before they arrived. But then something unexpected happened. The man reached into his backpack and pulled out what appeared to be a flare gun. He fired it directly at the nearest creature, the bright red flame striking its chest and exploding in a shower of sparks. The entity staggered backward, its phosphorescent glow flickering momentarily. "The boat!" the man shouted to his companion. "Get to the boat!" They ran, pushing through the circle of creatures with desperate strength. The entities seemed stunned by the unexpected resistance, their careful choreography disrupted by the couple's refusal to submit quietly. For a moment, it looked like they might actually escape. But the creatures recovered quickly. They pursued the fleeing couple with inhuman speed, their forms becoming more solid and threatening as they abandoned their hypnotic gliding for a more direct approach. The man fired his flare gun again, but the creatures had learned from the first shot and easily avoided the projectile. The woman reached the boat first, frantically working to untie the mooring lines while her companion held off the pursuing entities. But the creatures were too fast, too coordinated. They reached the dock just as the boat's engine roared to life. What happened next unfolded with horrible clarity in the pale light. The creatures didn't simply attack the couple, they began their ritual. The same guttural chanting that we had heard earlier filled the air, but now it was accompanied by sounds that I never want to hear again. The man's screams cut through the night like a blade, followed by the woman's pleas for mercy. "We can't just watch this," James said, his face pale with horror. But we were trapped by our own cowardice and the certainty that any intervention would only add us to the creature's victim count. We pressed our faces to the window, unable to look away from the nightmare unfolding on our dock. The ritual lasted for what felt like hours, though it was probably only minutes. The creatures performed their ceremony with practiced efficiency, their movements following a pattern that had been established long before we arrived. The couple's screams gradually faded, replaced by the same eerie silence that had preceded their arrival. When it was over, the creatures dispersed as quickly as they had gathered. They melted back into the fog, leaving behind only the evidence of what had occurred. The boat bobbed gently at the dock, its engine still running, but there was no sign of its former occupants. "They're gone," James whispered, though we both knew it was more than that. The couple hadn't simply been killed. They had been consumed, absorbed into whatever dark purpose the creatures served. The ritual had been completed, the sacrifice accepted, and now the entity's attention was turning back to us. The fog began to thicken again, and with it came the return of the creatures. They moved with renewed purpose, their earlier patience replaced by something that felt like hunger. The ritual with the couple had been an appetizer, a preparation for the main course. "Our turn," I said, surprised by how calm my voice sounded. James nodded, his face set in grim determination. "At least we know what we're facing now." But knowing what was coming didn't make it any easier to accept. The creatures were gathering around the cabin again, their phosphorescent glow creating an otherworldly light that seemed to pulse with the rhythm of a massive heart. They were no longer content to wait, no longer interested in psychological warfare. The hunt was about to begin in earnest, and we were running out of time to find a way to survive it. The creature's approach was different this time. Gone was the careful stalking, the psychological torment, the ritualistic circling. They moved with the confident stride of predators who had already worn down their prey, ready to claim their prize. The phosphorescent glow emanating from their bodies grew brighter, casting eerie shadows that danced across the cabin walls. "They're done playing," James said, his voice steady despite the terror in his eyes. I nodded, checking the makeshift barricades we had built around the doors and windows. Chairs, tables, and anything else we could move had been stacked against the entry points, but I knew it would only slow them down. These creatures had demonstrated intelligence, patience, and now they were showing their true power. The first impact came against the front door. The entire cabin shook as something massive struck the wooden barrier, sending our carefully constructed barricade sliding backward. A second blow followed, then a third. The creatures weren't trying to be subtle anymore. They were attempting to smash their way in through sheer force. "The back door," I called out, hearing similar sounds from the rear of the cabin. We were being attacked from multiple directions simultaneously. The creatures had learned the layout of our shelter during their earlier surveillance, and now they were exploiting every weakness. The windows rattled in their frames as claws scraped against the glass, probing for purchase. James grabbed a heavy cast-iron pan from the kitchen, while I found a baseball bat that had been left behind by previous visitors. We stood back to back in the center of the main room, watching as our defenses crumbled around us. The sounds of splintering wood and breaking glass filled the air. "Whatever happens," I said, "we don't give up. We fight until the end." The front door gave way first. The wooden frame splintered with a sound like thunder, and our barricade collapsed in a cascade of furniture. Through the opening, I could see the creatures pressed together, their eyes glowing with anticipation. But they didn't immediately pour through the breach. Instead, they seemed to be waiting for something. Then I understood. This wasn't just an attack. It was still part of their ritual. They were savoring this moment, drawing out our terror for their own purposes. The fear was as important to them as the final outcome. The largest creature stepped through the doorway, its massive form filling the entire opening. Up close, I could see details that made my skin crawl. Its skin wasn't quite flesh, but something that seemed to shift and change as I watched. The eyes were too large, too knowing, and they fixed on me with an intelligence that was both ancient and alien. "You have seen much," it said, its voice a low rumble that seemed to come from somewhere deep in its chest. "You have witnessed the old ways, the proper ceremonies. You understand now what this place truly is." I was too shocked to respond. The creature could speak, could communicate in perfect English despite its obviously inhuman nature. It wasn't just an animal following instinct. It was something far more dangerous. "This lake has been sacred for centuries," the creature continued, moving slowly into the cabin. "Long before your people built their shelters here, we performed our rituals on these shores. You are guests in our domain, and guests must follow our customs." More creatures entered behind the first, forming a loose circle around us. They moved with the same fluid grace I had observed earlier, but now I could see the terrible purpose behind their movements. They weren't just hunting us, they were preparing us for something. "The ritual requires willing participants," the creature explained. "Those who understand their role, who accept their place in the ancient order. You have been tested, observed, judged worthy. You should feel honored." "Go to hell," James said, raising his cast-iron pan. The creature that had been speaking turned its attention to him, and I saw something that might have been amusement in its alien features. "Your spirit is strong. That is good. The ceremony works best when the participants fight back." It moved faster than I would have thought possible. One moment it was standing across the room. The next, it was looming over James, its massive hands reaching for him. He swung the pan with all his strength, connecting with the creature's head in a blow that would have felled any human. The creature barely noticed. It caught James by the throat and lifted him off the ground, holding him at eye level. For a moment they stared at each other, predator and prey, ancient and modern, inhuman and human. Then the creature began to squeeze. I screamed and swung the baseball bat at the creature's back, putting every ounce of strength I possessed into the blow. The bat connected with a sound like hitting a tree trunk, but the creature didn't even turn around. It was focused entirely on James, who was struggling futilely against its grip. That's when I noticed the other creatures weren't participating in the attack. They were watching, observing, as if James's struggle was part of their entertainment. They wanted to see how long he could fight, how much resistance he could offer before succumbing to their power. But James had one advantage they hadn't counted on. The flare gun from the boat was still in his jacket pocket, and in his desperation he managed to reach it. He pressed the barrel against the creature's chest and pulled the trigger. The flare exploded in a shower of sparks and flame, and for the first time the creature showed genuine pain. It dropped James and staggered backward, its phosphorescent glow flickering like a dying light bulb. The smell of burning flesh filled the cabin, acrid and nauseating. Fire, I realized. They're vulnerable to fire. The other creatures seemed to understand this as well. They began to move with more urgency, their casual confidence replaced by something that might have been concern. James scrambled to his feet, still clutching the flare gun, and I noticed that the fireplace poker was within reach. "The fireplace!" I shouted, grabbing the poker and thrusting it into the dying embers of our earlier fire. "We need to get to the fireplace." But the creatures were already moving to cut us off. They formed a tighter circle, their movements more aggressive now that they understood we had found a weapon they feared. The injured creature was recovering, its wounds healing with unnatural speed, but it kept its distance from James and his flare gun. "One shot left," James said, checking the flare gun's chamber. "We need to make it count." I looked around the cabin, searching for anything that might help us. The propane tank for the stove was in the kitchen, but it was too far away. The oil lamp on the table was closer, but I'd need to get past two creatures to reach it. Then I remembered something from my childhood visits to this cabin. My grandfather had kept a cache of emergency supplies in the basement, including extra fuel for the boat. If we could get to the basement stairs, we might find something that could even the odds. "The basement," I told James. "There's fuel down there." He nodded, understanding immediately. We began to move toward the narrow staircase that led to the lower level, but the creatures anticipated our plan. They pressed closer, their alien features twisted with what might have been frustration. The largest creature spoke again, its voice now tinged with anger. "You cannot escape the ritual. You cannot change what has been ordained. Accept your fate, and your passing will be swift." "No," I said, surprised by the strength in my own voice. "We won't be part of your ceremony. We won't be your victims." The creature's eyes narrowed, and I saw something dangerous flicker in their depths. "Then you will die slowly, and your suffering will be all the greater." It lunged forward, and James fired his remaining flare directly into its face. The creature screamed, a sound that was barely recognizable as coming from any living thing, and stumbled backward. But even as it writhed in pain, the other creatures pressed their attack. We ran for the basement stairs, but I knew we wouldn't make it. The creatures were too fast, too coordinated, too determined. We had managed to wound one of them, but there were at least a dozen more, and they were no longer interested in playing games. As claws reached for my back and inhuman voices rose in triumph, I realized that our time had run out. The ritual was about to reach its conclusion, and we were powerless to stop it. But sometimes, when all hope seems lost, help arrives from the most unexpected sources. The sound of multiple boat engines roared across the water, accompanied by the brilliant beam of searchlights cutting through the fog. Human voices shouted commands, and the sharp crack of gunfire echoed across the lake. The creatures froze, their attention drawn to the new arrivals. For the first time since this nightmare began, they looked uncertain, almost afraid. The ritual had been interrupted, their carefully laid plans disrupted by an outside force they hadn't anticipated. "Search and rescue," James gasped, recognizing the organized nature of the response. "Someone must have reported us missing." The creatures began to retreat, their phosphorescent glow fading as they melted back into the fog. But their leader, the one James had wounded, turned back to us one final time. "This is not over," it said, its voice carrying clearly despite the sounds of the approaching rescue team. "The ritual will be completed. If not with you, then with others. This place remembers, and we are patient." Then they were gone, vanishing into the mist as if they had never existed at all. James and I stood alone in the ruined cabin, surrounded by evidence of our ordeal, but with no proof of what had really happened. The rescue team found us 20 minutes later, huddled together on the dock and clearly in shock. They had been searching for the missing couple whose boat had been found drifting empty on the lake. They asked us questions about what we had seen, but how could we explain creatures that spoke in ancient tongues and glowed with their own light? We told them about strange sounds in the night, about feeling watched, about our decision to leave the island. The officials accepted our story, attributing our terror to the stress of being lost in the fog and the shock of finding the abandoned boat. But I knew the truth. The creatures were still out there, still performing their rituals, still waiting for their next victims. The lake would remain empty for a while, but eventually, new visitors would arrive. People who didn't know the history of this place, who couldn't read the warnings carved into the trees. As the rescue boat carried us back to the mainland, I looked back at the island one final time. The fog was clearing, revealing the cabin in the pale light of dawn. For just a moment, I thought I saw shapes moving among the trees, watching our departure. The ritual would continue, I knew. The creatures would wait and plan, and eventually, they would find new participants for their ancient ceremony. But it wouldn't be us. We had survived, and we would never return to Lake Mistral. Some places are meant to remain empty, meant to be left alone. This was one of them, and I pray that others will heed the warnings we were too stubborn to recognize. The old ways are still practiced in the remote corners of the world, and some traditions are too terrible to be allowed to continue. But stopping them would require more than just avoiding the places where they occur. It would require confronting the creatures that perform them, and that is a task I am not brave enough to undertake. All I can do is share this story, and hope that others will learn from our mistakes. The wilderness is vast and beautiful, but it is also home to things that should not be disturbed. We learned that lesson the hard way, and we were lucky to survive the teaching. The next time you hear stories about missing people in remote locations, about boats found drifting empty on isolated lakes, about campers who vanish without a trace, remember what happened to us. Remember that some mysteries are better left unsolved, and some places are better left unvisited. The creatures are still out there, still waiting, still performing their ancient rituals, and they are far more patient than we could ever be. I moved to the cabin in October 2019, seeking the peace that only deep wilderness could provide. At 28, I'd grown tired of city noise and the constant hum of civilization. The property sat on 43 acres of dense pine forest in northern Montana, miles from the nearest neighbor. The previous owner, an elderly man named Garrison, had warned me about the isolation during our final walkthrough. "Gets real quiet out here," he'd said, his weathered hands trembling slightly as he handed over the keys. "Some folks can't handle that kind of quiet." I'd laughed then, eager to embrace the solitude. The cabin itself was modest but sturdy. 2 bedrooms, a stone fireplace, and windows that looked out into an endless sea of evergreens. I'd brought my German Shepherd, Rex, a loyal companion who'd adapted to our new life with enthusiasm. Together, we'd established routines, morning hikes, evening maintenance, and the simple pleasure of watching seasons change from our front porch. The chicken coop had been my idea, a way to achieve some self-sufficiency while adding life to the property. I'd spent weeks reinforcing it with hardware cloth and steel mesh, creating what I believed was an impenetrable fortress for my dozen hens. The morning ritual of collecting eggs and the gentle clucking of the birds brought a satisfaction I'd never experienced in my previous urban existence. For the first year, everything felt perfect. I'd wake to birdsong, spend my days writing freelance articles, and fall asleep to the comforting sounds of wind through pine needles. Rex would patrol the property with the confidence of a seasoned guardian, occasionally barking at deer or raccoons but never showing real alarm. The woods felt safe, familiar, almost protective. But paradise has a way of revealing its shadows, and mine began to show themselves gradually, almost imperceptibly at first. The first sign of trouble came in March 2021. I'd set my favorite coffee mug on the porch railing while checking the chicken coop, and when I returned 10 minutes later, it was gone. I searched the ground, thinking it might have fallen, but found nothing. Rex sniffed around the area with unusual intensity, his hackles rising slightly before he whined and moved away. Over the following weeks, other items vanished. A work glove I'd left on the woodpile, a flashlight from the shed. Small things, easily misplaced, but the pattern troubled me. I'd lived alone long enough to know my habits, and I wasn't careless with my belongings. The chickens provided the first real evidence that something was wrong. I'd started with 12 birds, but by late spring, I was down to 8. No feathers, no signs of struggle, no damage to the coop. The birds simply vanished overnight, as if they'd never existed. I reinforced the enclosure again, adding motion sensors and a battery-powered camera, but the disappearances continued. Rex began acting strangely around this time. He'd stand at the edge of the clearing, staring into the tree line with the kind of focus that made my skin crawl. His ears would prick forward, and he'd emit low, rumbling growls at something I couldn't see or hear. When I'd call him, he'd reluctantly return, but his eyes would keep darting back to the woods. I told myself it was probably a fox or a weasel, maybe a fisher cat that had learned to exploit weaknesses in my defenses. I researched predator behavior, adjusted my barriers, and even considered getting a rooster to alert me to intruders. But deep down, I knew something felt wrong about the whole situation. The woods themselves seemed different. The usual chorus of birds had diminished, and I rarely saw deer anymore. Even the squirrels appeared nervous, chattering frantically at sounds I couldn't identify. Rex refused to venture far from the cabin during our walks, staying close to my side with an alertness that suggested he knew something I didn't. The night of July 15th, 2021, changed everything. I'd been working late on a difficult article, the kind that required multiple drafts and constant revision. The clock showed 1:47 a.m. when I finally decided to call it quits. Rex was already asleep by the fireplace, exhausted from a day of anxious pacing. I was performing my nightly routine, checking doors, turning off lights, ensuring the generator was running properly, when the motion sensor near the shed triggered. The sudden flood of LED brightness cut through the darkness like a blade, illuminating the area where I stored tools and feed. At first I saw nothing unusual. The light had a tendency to activate when wind moved the pine branches, creating shifting shadows that could fool the sensor. But as I watched through the kitchen window, something moved at the edge of the illuminated area. It was human-shaped, but wrong in ways that made my mouth go dry. The figure crouched low, moving with a fluid, predatory grace that no person should possess. Its limbs seemed too long, its movements too quick and jerky. From my vantage point, I could see it examining the chicken coop with the methodical thoroughness of someone who'd done this before. Rex woke with a start, his head snapping toward the window. A growl built in his throat, deeper and more urgent than I'd ever heard from him. The sound seemed to carry across the yard, and the figure froze, turning its head toward the house with unnatural speed. I couldn't see its face clearly, but I'll never forget the way it moved, like a person pretending to be human, getting the mechanics right but missing some essential quality that would make it convincing. It approached the coop with deliberate steps, and I watched in horror as it began to dismantle my carefully constructed defenses. The reinforced mesh that had taken me hours to install was peeled away like paper. The steel locks I'd installed were twisted open with bare hands. Within minutes, the intruder had created an opening large enough to slip through, and I heard the panicked squawking of my remaining chickens. Rex's barking exploded through the silence, sharp and frantic. The intruder's head snapped up, and for a moment, our eyes met across the yard. The distance was too great to make out details, but I felt the weight of its attention like a physical force. There was intelligence in that gaze, a calculating awareness that sent waves of revulsion through my body. I grabbed my Remington 870 from the closet, hands shaking as I loaded it with .30 buckshot. The familiar weight of the weapon provided some comfort, but my military training felt rusty after years of civilian life. Rex continued barking, his voice hoarse with fear and aggression. The intruder straightened to its full height, and I realized it was taller than any person I'd ever seen. Its silhouette seemed to stretch impossibly upward, arms hanging at its sides with the loose, ready posture of a predator. It made no attempt to flee or hide, instead beginning to walk toward the house with measured, deliberate steps. I fumbled for my phone, trying to call for help, but the screen showed no signal. The isolation that had once felt peaceful now seemed like a trap. The nearest neighbor was 12 miles away, and the volunteer fire department would take at least 30 minutes to respond, if they believed my story. The intruder stopped at the edge of the porch light's reach, just visible enough to maintain eye contact. It raised one hand, and I saw fingers that seemed too long, nails that reflected the light like claws. The gesture was almost casual, as if it were greeting a neighbor, but the wrongness of it made my stomach turn. Rex's barking reached a fever pitch, and I realized the intruder was listening to him with the focused attention of someone learning a language. It tilted its head, mimicking Rex's movements with disturbing accuracy. When my dog finally exhausted himself and fell silent, the intruder nodded once, as if satisfied with what it had heard. I raised the shotgun, sighting down the barrel at the center of the figure's chest. My finger found the trigger, and I drew in a breath to steady my aim. But before I could fire, the intruder stepped backward into the darkness, disappearing so completely it might have been a hallucination. I spent the rest of that night barricaded in my bedroom, dresser pushed against the door, Rex pressed against my side. The shotgun lay across my knees, safety off, finger ready. Every sound outside, wind through branches, settling timbers, the distant call of an owl, sent adrenaline surging through my system. But it was the sounds that weren't quite right that truly terrified me. Footsteps on the porch that had too many beats, as if the walker had an extra joint in each leg, scratching at the walls that followed no pattern I could identify, the soft thud of something heavy landing on the roof, followed by the creak of shingles under weight. Rex whined continuously, his eyes fixed on the door, ears tracking sounds I couldn't hear. His fear was contagious, confirming that whatever was outside was real, not a product of my imagination. The dog's senses were sharper than mine, and his terror told me more about our situation than any amount of observation could. Around 3 a.m. I heard what sounded like my own voice calling from outside. "Hello? Is anyone there? I need help." The words were perfect, the tone concerned and friendly, but the timing was wrong. The voice came from directly beneath my bedroom window, as if the speaker were standing on nothing but air. I gripped the shotgun tighter, fighting the urge to respond. Some primitive part of my brain recognized the deception, even as another part wanted to help whoever was calling. Rex's growl deepened, and I could see his hackles raised in the dim light. The voice tried again, more insistent this time. "Please, I'm hurt. I need to use your phone." The words were exactly what I might have said if I'd been injured and seeking help, but they came from someone who had never heard human speech before learning to imitate it. I remained silent, and after what felt like hours, the voice moved away. But I could still hear movement around the house, the soft scrape of fingernails on wood, the whisper of fabric against siding, the barely audible sound of breathing that came from too close to the windows. Dawn couldn't come fast enough, and when the first rays of sunlight finally penetrated the forest canopy, I heard the sounds retreat. Whatever was outside seemed to withdraw with the darkness, leaving behind only the memory of its presence and the certainty that it would return. The morning revealed the full extent of the previous night's assault. The chicken coop had been completely destroyed, not just opened, but systematically dismantled. The remaining birds were gone, leaving behind only a few scattered feathers and dark stains on the ground that I didn't want to examine too closely. More disturbing were the tracks around the house. They appeared human at first glance, the right general shape and size, but closer inspection revealed abnormalities that made my skin crawl. The toes were too long, the heel too narrow, and the depth suggested someone much heavier than the slender figure I'd observed. Rex refused to leave the porch, whining whenever I tried to coax him into the yard. His reluctance convinced me that staying was no longer an option. I threw essential items into a duffel bag, clothes, documents, ammunition, and loaded them into my Jeep Wrangler. The drive down the forest road should have been routine, but every shadow between the trees seemed to hide a crouching figure. Rex sat in the passenger seat, alert and anxious, his head constantly turning to track movement I couldn't see. The forest felt different now, hostile and watchful, as if every tree were a potential hiding place. I was halfway to the main highway when I saw it standing in the road ahead. The morning sun cast long shadows through the trees, but the figure was solid and real, blocking my path with casual confidence. It stood perfectly still, arms at its sides, watching my approach with the patience of something that had all the time in the world. I gunned the engine, hoping to scare it away, but the figure didn't move. As I got closer, I could see details that made my hands shake on the steering wheel. Its face was wrong, too pale, too smooth, with eyes that reflected light like an animal's. The mouth was too wide, revealing teeth that were too sharp and too numerous. I swerved at the last second, tires screaming on asphalt as I barely missed the motionless form. In my rearview mirror, I saw it turn to watch me go, moving its head in a complete circle without shifting its shoulders. The impossible motion burned itself into my memory, a reminder that I was dealing with something beyond normal human experience. 2 weeks later, I returned to the cabin with 3 friends: Gordon, a veteran like myself; Preston, who worked construction and owned an impressive collection of firearms; and Briggs, a hunter who knew the local wildlife better than anyone. I told them about break-ins and vandalism, not wanting to share the full truth until I was certain of their support. We approached the property like a military operation, with planned positions and communication protocols. The cabin looked normal from the outside, but I could see evidence of the intruder's continued presence. Windows that I'd left closed were now open. Items on the porch had been rearranged in subtle ways that suggested someone had been examining them. Inside, the house felt violated. Nothing was obviously disturbed, but the air held a strange scent, musky and wild, like an animal's den. Rex refused to enter, instead pacing nervously beside the Jeep. My friends began loading boxes while I did a final walkthrough, checking for anything I might have missed. It was Preston who noticed the figure first. "Hey," he called from the porch, his voice tight with concern. "We've got company." I joined him outside and saw it immediately. The intruder standing at the edge of the clearing, watching our activities with the focused attention of a predator studying prey. In daylight, its abnormalities were even more pronounced. The proportions were wrong, the posture too still, the gaze too intense. Gordon emerged from the house carrying a box, took one look at the figure, and carefully set down his load. "What the hell is that thing?" "I don't know," I admitted, "but it's been stalking me for months." Briggs joined us, his hunting rifle already in hand. "That's not any animal I've ever seen. Looks like someone playing dress-up, but..." He trailed off, studying the figure through his scope. "The way it's standing, the way it's watching us, that's not human behavior." The intruder began to move, not directly toward us, but in a wide circle around the clearing. Its gait was fluid and predatory, each step placed with perfect precision. It kept its eyes on us throughout the movement, never breaking contact even when the angle should have made it impossible. We finished loading the truck quickly, weapons ready, constantly aware of the figure's presence. It had stopped circling and now stood directly between us and the access road, close enough that we could see details that made our situation clear. This was no human being. The face was a crude approximation of human features, as if someone had described a person to an artist who had never seen one. The eyes were too large, set too far apart, and they didn't blink. The mouth was a gash across the lower face, revealing rows of teeth that belonged on no mammal I'd ever seen. "We need to get out of here," Gordon said, his voice steady despite the fear in his eyes. "Now." I was doing a final count of our group when I realized Preston was missing. We'd been so focused on the figure in the clearing that we'd lost track of each other. Panic surged through me as I called his name, receiving no response. We found him behind the cabin, unconscious and badly injured. Deep gashes across his back and arms suggested an attack by something with claws, but the wounds were too precise, too systematic. It was as if the attacker had been studying human anatomy and testing different approaches. Gordon and I carried Preston to the truck while Briggs kept watch. The figure had vanished from the clearing, but I could feel its presence in the surrounding forest. Rex barked frantically from the passenger seat, his attention focused on the tree line where shadows moved independently of the wind. We drove to the hospital in tense silence, Preston unconscious between us. When the emergency room staff asked about his injuries, we blamed a bear attack, the only explanation that wouldn't result in psychiatric evaluation. The doctors accepted our story, though I caught several exchanging glances that suggested they'd seen similar injuries before. Preston recovered, though he never spoke about what happened behind the cabin. He'd been found with no memory of the attack, and the doctors attributed his amnesia to trauma. But sometimes when he thought no one was watching, I'd catch him staring into empty spaces with the expression of someone who remembered more than he wanted to admit. I never returned to the cabin. The insurance company eventually paid out on a claim of vandalism and theft, and I used the money to buy a small apartment in Denver. City noise that had once driven me to the wilderness now feels like protection against the silence that harbors things better left undisturbed. Rex adapted to urban life with visible relief, though he still refuses to approach wooded areas. Sometimes, late at night, I'll find him standing at the window, looking out at the streetlights with the same alertness he'd shown in the forest. When I ask what he sees, he just whines and comes to sit beside me as if seeking comfort from memories we both carry. The woods of northern Montana remain untouched, 43 acres of wilderness that will never again know human habitation. Sometimes I wonder if the thing that stalked me is still there, waiting for the next person seeking solitude to discover that some places are empty for good reason. I've learned to appreciate the constant hum of civilization, the steady flow of traffic, the voices of neighbors through thin walls. These sounds, once irritating, now remind me that I'm surrounded by humanity, protection against the things that watch from the spaces between. The solitude I once craved has been replaced by a deep need for connection, for the constant reassurance that I'm not alone. Because in the deepest woods, in the places where cell phones don't work and the nearest neighbor is miles away, isolation isn't peace, it's vulnerability. The Trans-Canada Highway fell away behind me as I turned onto the logging road, my Jeep bouncing over the uneven ground. 3 hours north of Thunder Bay, Ontario, I was already deeper into the wilderness than most weekend campers ventured. The radio had stopped picking up signals an hour ago, leaving only the rumble of tires on gravel and the occasional ping of rocks against the undercarriage. My name is Daniel Mercer, wildlife photographer and self-proclaimed adventure junkie. After 15 years of capturing images across 6 continents, I'd returned to my native Canada with a singular purpose: to document the untouched corners of the boreal forest. At least, that's what I told my editor. The truth was more complex, wrapped in childhood memories and local legends that had haunted the northern communities for generations. The Algonquin called it Wendigo territory. The loggers had their own stories of the hairy man of the woods. Scientists dismissed it all as folklore, but the locals knew better. Something walked these forests that defied conventional explanation. The GPS blinked out as pine branches closed overhead, forming a natural tunnel. I consulted my topographical map, tracing the route to Mackenzie Lake, a pristine body of water that hadn't seen regular human traffic since the logging operation shut down in '97. According to my research, there had been 17 reported sightings within 50 kilometers of the lake since 1985, 3 in the last year alone. As dusk approached, I found the clearing I'd marked, a natural opening among ancient pines with a view of the western shoreline, perfect for both camp and wildlife observation. I worked efficiently, pitching my 4-season tent, hanging my food cache from a branch well away from my sleeping area, and setting up my primary camera trap facing the game trail that cut through the northern edge of the clearing. Only when the necessities were secured did I allow myself to listen to the forest. The wind whispered through pine needles, carrying scents of resin and decay. Somewhere distant, a loon called across water, its mournful cry echoing unanswered. But underneath it all was something else, a sensation more than a sound, the weight of awareness, of being watched. "Just wildlife," I murmured, feeding branches into my small camp stove. The flames cast dancing shadows across my equipment. Bears, wolves, maybe a moose. Nothing unusual. I'd spent enough nights in the wilderness to recognize the normal prickle of caution that comes with being a vulnerable human in predator territory. This felt different, more targeted, more deliberate. As full darkness descended, I reviewed my equipment one final time. Cameras, satellite phone, bear spray, and the Winchester rifle I'd inherited from my grandfather. I wasn't typically one for firearms, but something about this trip had prompted me to bring it. Call it intuition, call it paranoia. A branch snapped in the darkness, loud, deliberate, from somewhere beyond the light of my fire. Too heavy for a deer, too careless for a predator. I reached for the rifle, flicking the safety off with practiced ease. "Hello?" I called, my voice sounding unnaturally loud. "Anyone there?" The forest went silent. No insects, no rustling leaves, nothing. Then came the smell, musky, primal, like wet fur and old blood. A smell no experienced woodsman would mistake for anything familiar. In my 15 years of wilderness photography across the globe, I'd encountered predators of all kinds. I'd documented tigers in India, polar bears in the Arctic, and crocodiles in the Amazon. But nothing in my experience had prepared me for what I felt in that moment. Pure, instinctual dread. Something inhuman was circling my camp. Sleep came in fitful bursts that night, my hand never far from the rifle beside my sleeping bag. Each time I drifted off, I'd jerk awake to sounds just beyond perception. Heavy footfalls, breathing that didn't match the rhythm of the forest. And once, a guttural vocalization unlike any animal I could identify. When dawn finally broke, I found the first evidence that my fears weren't merely imagination. A perfect line of tracks skirting the perimeter of my camp, pressed deep into the soft earth. Bigger than any bear print I'd ever documented. The stride length alone suggested a creature over 7 feet tall. I photographed each print methodically, placing my size 11 boot beside one for scale. My foot looked childlike in comparison. As I followed the tracks to the edge of the clearing, I discovered something that made my blood run cold. One of my remote camera traps had been dismantled, not destroyed in the way a curious bear might, but carefully taken apart, the memory card missing. Something intelligent, something deliberate, something that understood exactly what my equipment was designed to do. And it didn't want to be seen. The lake stretched before me like a mirror, reflecting the morning sky with perfect clarity. Mackenzie Lake was renowned among locals for its unusual depth, over 200 meters in some places, and the strange stories that surrounded it. Indigenous elders spoke of spirits dwelling beneath its surface, and even the hardened loggers who'd worked the area refused to fish its waters. I paddled my collapsible kayak toward the center, intent on gathering samples for a biologist friend researching microbiome variations in isolated water systems. The rhythmic dip and pull of my paddle was meditative, allowing my mind to process the unsettling discoveries of the morning. The tracks were real, not imagination, not a practical joke. Something massive had circled my camp during the night, something intelligent enough to disable a camera trap. Rationalize it, I whispered to myself, words creating small puffs of condensation in the cool morning air. Black bear standing on hind legs, maybe a moose with unusual gait. But the excuses rang hollow. I'd tracked both species extensively. These were bipedal prints with 5 distinct toe impressions. Too large for human, too structured for bear. A loon surfaced nearby, its red eyes regarding me with ancient curiosity before disappearing beneath the surface. I watched the ripples spread outward, mesmerized by the perfect symmetry of their expansion. Then I noticed that another set of ripples was intersecting with the first, ripples that couldn't have come from the diving bird. Something else had disturbed the water, something large, moving beneath the surface parallel to my kayak. I froze, paddle suspended mid-stroke, watching as the disturbance created a subtle wake. Whatever was down there was at least the size of a large sturgeon, but moved with deliberate purpose rather than the sinuous pattern of a fish. The wake disappeared, and I exhaled a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. Just as I convinced myself it was simply an underwater current, the kayak jolted violently upward, nearly capsizing as something struck its underside. Heart pounding, I scrambled to stabilize the craft. Water sloshed over the sides, soaking my equipment. I reached for my waterproof camera, desperate to document whatever was happening, when the attack came again. This time with enough force to send me sprawling into the frigid waters of Mackenzie Lake. The cold hit like a physical blow, driving air from my lungs. I surfaced gasping, just in time to see my kayak flipping completely over. My sample containers and scientific equipment sank rapidly into the crystal-clear depths. Through the perfect visibility, I watched them disappear into a darkness so absolute it seemed to swallow light itself. I treaded water, calculating my position. The shore was perhaps 200 meters away, a challenging swim in cold water, but manageable for someone with my experience. I struck out with powerful strokes, fighting the growing numbness in my extremities. Halfway to shore, I felt it, a gentle brush against my leg. Not the bump of a fish or the tangle of weeds, but the unmistakable sensation of fingers, long, powerful digits curling briefly around my ankle before releasing. Panic surged through me, overriding training and experience. I thrashed toward shore with desperate intensity, no longer concerned with form or efficiency. Behind me, something large displaced water. I could feel the pressure wave against my feet and legs. I didn't look back. Some primal instinct warned that seeing what pursued me would steal precious seconds I couldn't afford to lose. My feet finally struck bottom near the shoreline, and I half swam, half staggered onto the rocky beach, collapsing onto the stones. For several minutes I simply lay there, coughing and shivering before gathering the courage to look back at the lake. The surface was again a perfect mirror, undisturbed by wind or wildlife. My overturned kayak was nowhere to be seen. It was as if the lake had swallowed it whole. As my breathing steadied, I noticed something on the shoreline several meters away. My waterproof camera case, deliberately placed on a flat rock, its latches carefully opened. The memory card was missing, just like the one from my camera trap. Something intelligent enough to recognize what held the images, something that didn't want to be recorded. I staggered back toward camp, hyper-aware of the forest around me. The sense of being watched had intensified, and twice I spun around, certain I'd glimpsed movement among the trees, a flash of something tall and dark slipping between trunks with impossible silence for its size. From across the lake came a sound that stopped me in my tracks. Not quite a howl, not quite a scream, but something that raised the hair on my neck and sent birds exploding from the treetops. It held for nearly 15 seconds, modulating in pitch and intensity in a way that suggested communication rather than random vocalization. I fumbled for my satellite phone, fingers trembling as I dialed the only person who might understand what I was experiencing. "Professor Nakamura," I said when the call connected, my voice tight with controlled panic. "It's Daniel Mercer. I'm at Mackenzie Lake. I think I've found it. And I think there's more than one." The line went dead, either from poor connection or something more deliberate. When I glanced down at the phone screen, a single message appeared before the device powered down completely. "Get out now. They're not what we thought." The afternoon sun filtered through the canopy as I inventoried what remained of my equipment. The loss of my kayak and underwater sampling gear was devastating, but the real blow was psychological. Whatever was in these woods, whatever had circled my camp and pursued me in the lake, was methodically isolating me. First the camera traps, then my satellite phone, which refused to power back on despite having shown nearly full battery moments before it died. Even my GPS unit was now displaying coordinates that made no sense, putting me somehow in northern Quebec rather than Ontario. I spread my topographical map across a flat rock, confirming my position the old-fashioned way. Mackenzie Lake was clearly marked, its unusual depth indicated by tightly clustered contour lines. I traced the shortest route back to the logging road, approximately 15 kilometers of dense forest, with one significant obstacle, a ravine cutting across my path about 5 kilometers east. "If I break camp now," I muttered, calculating distances against fading daylight, "I'd hit the ravine at dusk. Bad place to be after dark." The rational choice was to spend one more night, leave at first light, and push through to the road before nightfall tomorrow. But rationality was becoming increasingly difficult to cling to. I activated my backup satellite beacon, a simple emergency device that broadcast GPS coordinates to search and rescue services when triggered. It was meant as a last resort, but circumstances warranted caution. The small LED blinked reassuringly, indicating successful activation. Returning to camp, I discovered my tent had been disturbed. Not ripped open like a bear might do, but methodically searched. My sleeping bag lay unzipped, my clothing neatly piled rather than stuffed in the backpack where I'd left it. Most disturbing was the arrangement of my field guides on Canadian wildlife, open to pages on great apes and primates, forming a semicircle on the ground. It was a message. Or perhaps a question. From my backpack, I removed the small leather journal I'd found among my grandfather's belongings after his death. The pages were filled with meticulous notes and sketches documenting his encounters in these same forests 50 years earlier. Most wildlife biologists had dismissed his work as the fantasies of an amateur cryptozoologist, but I'd recognized the precision of his observations, the same methodical documentation I employed in my own work. I flipped to a dog-eared page containing a detailed sketch of a footprint nearly identical to those I'd photographed that morning. Beside it, my grandfather had written, "Linguistic capabilities confirmed. Responds to recorded calls. Evidence of tool use and social structure. Not ape, not human. Something parallel. Evolution finds many paths. Below this was a phonetic transcription of sounds he claimed to have recorded. Sounds remarkably similar to what I'd heard across the lake. The implications were staggering. If my grandfather was right, what walked these woods wasn't some undiscovered species of great ape, but something far more complex, a parallel evolutionary branch that had developed intelligence comparable to our own while remaining hidden from scientific documentation. The crack of a branch snapping jerked me from my thoughts. I reached for the rifle, scanning the forest edge. Nothing moved, but the sensation of being watched intensified. "I know you're there," I called, surprising myself with my boldness. "I'm not here to harm you. I just want to understand." Silence answered, heavy with potential. Then, from a different direction came another deliberate snap of wood. Then another from elsewhere in the forest. They were surrounding the camp again, just as they had the previous night. I retreated to the center of the clearing, rifle ready, but pointed safely at the ground. My grandfather's note suggested they understood the concept of weapons, possibly even firearms specifically. The forest had gone silent again, but this time the silence felt expectant rather than threatening. Testing a theory, I carefully set the rifle down on a flat rock, stepped back with hands raised, and waited. Minutes passed. Then, from the densest section of forest came a soft, rumbling vocalization. Not aggressive, but questioning. I remained still, hands visible, controlling my breathing despite the hammering of my heart. Movement caught my eye, a subtle shifting of shadows that didn't match the wind patterns through the trees. Something large moved with deliberate slowness, partially obscured by the undergrowth. I glimpsed what might have been an arm, massively muscled and covered in dark hair, reaching out to bend a sapling aside. Before I could see more, my emergency beacon erupted in a series of loud electronic beeps from inside my backpack, the automated response indicating the signal had been received and help was being dispatched. The reaction was immediate and terrifying. From all around the clearing came explosive vocalizations, not the curious rumbles of moments before, but alarm calls of unmistakable hostility. Trees shook as massive figures retreated rapidly into deeper forest. I lunged for my backpack, frantically digging for the beacon to silence it, but the damage was done. I'd inadvertently betrayed the tentative moment of contact. Worse, I'd associated myself with the electronic technology they seemed to distrust or fear. As night fell, I built my fire larger than safety would normally dictate, constructing a barrier of flames around my tent. The forest remained ominously quiet, but the sense of being watched had transformed into something more targeted, an evaluating presence that seemed to be making calculations. In the darkness beyond my firelight, eyes occasionally reflected the flames, not at ground level where deer or predators would be, but at a height of over 7 feet. They never remained visible for more than a second, blinking out of existence as their owners shifted position. I retreated to my tent with the rifle across my lap, reading through my grandfather's journal by flashlight. On the final pages, his handwriting had become increasingly urgent, the normally meticulous notes replaced by hastily scrawled warnings. They remember. Generations of conflict with loggers, hunters, trappers. They associate human technology with threat. The younger ones want war. The elders restrain them, but their influence wanes. Stay away from water. They use it. They've always used it. The final entry, dated just 3 weeks before his fatal hunting accident, simply read, "They've made their decision about me. I hear them outside now. If found, destroy cameras. Names in my will know what to do." I closed the journal with trembling hands, understanding now why my grandfather's body had been discovered with all recording equipment methodically destroyed, why his research had never been published despite his meticulous documentation. Outside my tent, something heavy moved past, close enough that the ground vibrated slightly with each footfall. Not circling now, but deliberately approaching. I raised the rifle, finger resting lightly beside the trigger guard. The zipper of my tent began to rise, pulled from outside by something strong enough to break the interior lock I'd secured. I aimed the rifle at the widening gap, fighting against panic. Instead of the massive, hairy figure I expected, a smooth stone rolled through the opening, coming to rest on my sleeping bag. In the beam of my flashlight, I could see it was no ordinary rock, but one that had been worked, shaped into a crude but recognizable humanoid form with deep grooves marking eyes and mouth. A warning? A message? Before I could decipher its meaning, my radio crackled to life. Equipment I'd written off as useless hours ago. Through bursts of static came a voice I recognized immediately. Professor Nakamura. Repeat, Daniel. If you can hear this, evacuate immediately. They're not what folklore suggests. Soviet research from the 60s, classified until now, confirms cognitive capabilities exceeding problem-solving parameters. They're watching the roads. Use water routes if possible. Nightfall is when they... The transmission cut off abruptly, replaced by a different sound. A perfect mimicry of Nakamura's voice, but speaking words the professor would never use. Come to us, Daniel. We've been waiting for someone like you, someone who understands. Dawn broke with eerie silence. No birdsong, no rustling leaves, not even the whisper of wind through the pine needles. I emerged from my tent, rifle ready, surveying the clearing with bloodshot eyes. Sleep had been impossible after the radio transmission and its disturbing conclusion. The stone figure remained where it had rolled onto my sleeping bag, its crude features somehow more unsettling in daylight. I photographed it from multiple angles, noting the precision of certain cuts that suggested tools more sophisticated than simple stone implements. Around the perimeter of my camp, a perfect circle of broken pine branches had been laid during the night, each pointing inward toward my tent. The pattern was undeniably deliberate, a boundary of some kind. Whether it represented protection or containment, I couldn't determine. My grandfather's journal offered no insight into this specific behavior, but his final pages contained a hand-drawn map that hadn't made sense until now. What I'd taken for random markings clearly indicated territories and boundaries across the Mackenzie Lake region. According to his notations, I was now deep within what he labeled as central gathering grounds, the heart of their territory. The implications were staggering. If correct, this wasn't just about a single creature or even a small family group. This suggested a complex social structure with defined territories and potentially a population far larger than anyone had suspected. I broke camp with methodical efficiency, packing only what was essential for rapid travel. The logging road remained my best hope for evacuation, but Nakamura's broken transmission had mentioned water routes. I studied my map, noting a stream that flowed southeast from Mackenzie Lake, eventually joining a river system that would lead to inhabited areas. It meant abandoning my original path and traveling through completely unfamiliar terrain, but the alternative was facing whatever waited along the more direct route through the forest. Water routes, I murmured, recalling my grandfather's warning. Stay away from water, they use it. Two contradictory warnings. Someone was wrong or deliberately misleading me. I shouldered my pack and stepped carefully over the circle of pine branches, half expecting some reaction. The forest remained unnaturally still, but the feeling of being watched had intensified. Without my kayak, following the stream meant traveling along its banks, exposed and vulnerable. The first kilometer passed without incident. The stream widened gradually, flowing with surprising force through the rocky terrain. I documented everything: odd arrangements of stones along the banks, unusual breaks in vegetation patterns, a series of scratches on trees that formed no pattern I recognized from known wildlife. At a bend where the stream widened into a small pool, I discovered the first clear evidence I wasn't alone. Half submerged in the shallows lay what remained of my kayak, methodically disassembled. The aluminum frame had been separated from the canvas shell, each piece laid out in precise order of size. More disturbing were the additions: intricate bindings of woven plant fibers securing wooden extensions to the frame, transforming it into something that resembled a primitive trap or cage. The craftsmanship was undeniable, showing not just intelligence, but sophisticated understanding of materials and structural engineering. I photographed everything, struggling to maintain scientific detachment. This wasn't random destruction or animal curiosity. This was methodical repurposing. Technology being adapted by a non-human intelligence. The stones came without warning, not thrown directly at me, but landing with precision in a semicircle about 5 meters ahead, blocking my progress along the stream bank. I froze, scanning the forest and opposite shore. Nothing moved, yet I could feel multiple presences, coordinating their actions with tactical precision. From upstream came a series of vocalizations, low rumbling calls that modulated in complex patterns. They were answered from downstream by higher-pitched, rapid responses. I recognized the structure from recordings my grandfather had meticulously documented. Not random animal sounds, but communication with syntax and meaning. They were coordinating, hurting me. I had two choices: retreat into the forest, away from the water but potentially into a prepared ambush, or continue forward into whatever they were directing me toward. Neither option promised safety. I chose a third path. Dropping my pack on the shore, I waded into the stream itself, gasping as the cold water reached my thighs. If they used water roots, as my grandfather claimed, perhaps direct confrontation in their element would demonstrate I wasn't easily intimidated. The reaction was immediate. The forest erupted with alarm calls, harsh, barking vocalizations that echoed across the water. Trees shook as massive bodies moved rapidly through the undergrowth, converging on my position. "I'm not your enemy," I shouted, raising empty hands above my head. "I want to understand." From the densest section of forest across the stream, something emerged, not fully into the open, but enough that I caught my first clear glimpse of what had been stalking me. Over 7 feet tall, its massive frame covered in dark reddish-brown hair, standing upright with an unmistakably hominid posture. What struck me most weren't the physical dimensions, impressive as they were, but the eyes, deep set beneath a heavy brow ridge, reflecting an intelligence that evaluated me with unmistakable calculation. Our gazes locked for perhaps 3 seconds before it melted back into the forest with astonishing silence for its size. In those brief moments, I recognized something that shook me to my core, not fear or aggression, but recognition. It knew exactly what I was, and more disturbingly, seemed to know why I was there. A splash upstream drew my attention. A crude raft of bound logs was floating toward me, guided by the current. Atop it lay my missing satellite phone, GPS unit, and the memory cards from my cameras, all arranged with deliberate care. The message was unmistakable. An exchange. My technology for what? Safe passage? The water around me suddenly felt dangerous in ways that had nothing to do with current or depth. I waded quickly back to shore, heart pounding. As I reached for my backpack, I noticed it had been moved, slightly repositioned and partially opened. Inside, my grandfather's journal was gone, replaced by another stone figure, larger and more elaborately carved than the first. This one depicted not a single form, but a pair. One clearly representing a human, the other the creature I'd glimpsed. Between them was a carved divot containing 3 small white objects. Human teeth. I staggered back, nearly falling into the stream. The forest had gone completely silent again, the oppressive stillness broken only by my ragged breathing. From all around came the soft sounds of movement, not retreating this time, but closing in with deliberate purpose. They'd made their decision about me, just as they'd made their decision about my grandfather 50 years before. I ran. Night fell as I pushed through dense underbrush, lungs burning, legs leaden with exhaustion. I'd abandoned the stream hours ago, navigating by compass alone after discovering my map missing from my pack, another calculated move to disorient me. Without landmarks I recognized, I could only maintain a southeast heading and hope it would eventually lead to civilization. Each time I stopped to rest, the forest around me went silent, only to erupt with movement once I resumed my journey. They weren't pursuing so much as herding, steering me along a path of their choosing. Twice I'd attempted to double back or change direction, only to find my way blocked by strategically positioned obstacles, fallen trees too precisely placed to be natural, rock formations that hadn't been there minutes before. As full darkness descended, I was forced to make camp in a small depression beneath an outcropping of rock. Without my tent, lost somewhere during the frantic flight, I constructed a rudimentary shelter from pine boughs, creating the illusion of protection more than any actual security. I inventoried what remained of my supplies: half a liter of water, 2 protein bars, my hunting knife, a small first aid kit, and the Winchester rifle with 17 remaining rounds. My cameras were gone, as was most of my specialized equipment. The satellite beacon had disappeared from my pack, eliminating any hope of summoning rescue. Most disturbing was the discovery that the stone figure with human teeth had somehow made its way back into my pack, despite my having discarded it during my flight. Someone, something, had been close enough to replace it without my awareness. As I huddled in my makeshift shelter, the darkness around me came alive with sound. Not the normal nocturnal chorus of the forest, but deliberate communications. From the ridge above came a series of low, rumbling calls, answered from the valley below by higher-pitched responses. They were coordinating, positioning themselves strategically around my location. I checked the rifle for the dozenth time, knowing that if they decided to rush my position, 17 rounds would mean nothing against their numbers. My grandfather's final journal entries haunted me. They've made their decision about me. Had they decided I was a threat to be eliminated? Or was I being tested, evaluated against some criteria I couldn't begin to comprehend? Sleep came in microbursts, consciousness fading for seconds rather than minutes or hours. Each time I jerked awake, something had changed in my immediate surroundings. Small arrangements of twigs and patterns too precise to be random. Stones placed in sequential order of size. Once even my water bottle moved from one side of the shelter to the other. They were studying me, just as I had come to study them. As false dawn lightened the eastern sky, I became aware of a new presence, not the intimidating surveillance of the previous night, but something more focused, more singular. I raised the rifle, peering through the gloom at a figure silhouetted against the gray light. Human. A man of late middle age, dressed in worn outdoor clothing that had seen hard use. He stood perfectly still, observing my shelter with an unnerving calm that matched the creatures themselves. "Daniel Mercer," he said, voice rough from disuse. "You look like him. Your grandfather." I tightened my grip on the rifle. "Who are you?" "Someone who made a different choice." He approached slowly, hands visible and empty. "They call me Walker. At least, that's how I translate it." As he drew closer, I could see his face clearly, weathered by decades of exposure, deeply lined, with eyes that reflected something between serenity and resignation. What struck me most was the precise arrangement of scars along his jawline and forehead, deliberate markings that formed patterns similar to those I'd seen on trees throughout the forest. "You live with them," I said, comprehension dawning. "You're why they understand our technology." Walker nodded, settling himself on a rock opposite my shelter. "I was a graduate student when I first came here in '86. Biological anthropology. I'd heard rumors about your grandfather's research after his death. The university dismissed it, but I recognized the methodology. He wasn't delusional." "What happened to him?" I asked, the question that had driven my return to these forests. "He discovered too much, too quickly. Pushed for contact before understanding their social structures." Walker's eyes grew distant. "They're not a single homogeneous group, Daniel. There are factions, lineages, complex political structures. Some believe humans should be studied from a distance. Others view us as an existential threat to be eliminated. Still others see potential for exchange." "And which faction has been stalking me for the past 2 days?" "All of them," he said simply. "Your presence has forced a decision they've been avoiding for generations. Your grandfather began it, but you, carrying his blood, his research, you represent something symbolic to them." From the forest behind, Walker came a low, rumbling vocalization. He responded without turning, producing sounds no human throat should naturally create. The exchange continued for nearly a minute before he turned back to me. "They're offering you the same choice they offered me 38 years ago," he said, expression grave. "Leave now, destroy all records of your encounter, never return, or stay and learn. But staying means never returning to human society. The knowledge they possess, what they are, how they've remained hidden, it cannot spread." "And if I refuse both options?" Walker's face remained impassive. "Then you won't leave these woods at all." I studied him, noting the subtle changes in his posture and movements, the way he shifted his weight like something far larger than a human, the careful precision of his gestures that matched what I had observed in the glimpses of my stalkers. "How many of you are there?" I asked. "Humans who've chosen to stay?" 17 living, spread across North America, most much older than me. They rarely extend the invitation." His expression softened slightly. Your grandfather would have been among us, but he couldn't leave your grandmother, your mother. Family bonds they understood, respected. It's why they allowed him to leave with his life, if not his research. From the forest came another call, more urgent. Walker stood. Dawn comes soon. They don't meet in open daylight, not for this. Your answer, Daniel Mercer. The weight of the decision pressed down on me like a physical force. Everything I'd worked toward, my career, my relationships, my identity in human society, against knowledge no other scientist had ever accessed, understanding that would rewrite anthropological history. If I stay, I said slowly, could I ever send word to my family? Let them know I'm alive at least? Walker's expression held genuine sympathy. No. The separation must be absolute. To them, you'll be another wilderness disappearance, another mystery. It's the only way to maintain the balance. I thought of my sparse apartment in Toronto, my colleagues at the university, the few friends who might notice my absence. Then I thought of my grandfather's eyes in the old photographs, the haunted knowledge they held, the questions that had driven him back to these forests again and again. I need to understand one thing first, I said. What are they? Not folklore, not myth, scientifically. Walker looked toward the lightening sky, then back to me. For the first time, I saw something like pride in his expression. They were here first, Daniel, long before Homo sapiens crossed from Asia. A parallel branch of evolution that developed different adaptations, different social structures. Not Neanderthal, not Denisovan, something parallel. They watched us build cities, develop technology, spread across the continent. And they made a collective decision to remain apart, to guard their existence through deliberate myth-making. The implications staggered me. And they allow humans like you, like us, to join them. Why? Genetic diversity, cultural exchange, and, he hesitated, insurance. If humanity ever discovered them en masse, they wanted individuals who could translate, negotiate. They're preparing for a future where hiding may no longer be possible. Dawn had broken fully now, golden light spilling through the trees. Walker extended his hand. Your answer, Daniel. They're waiting. The first snow of winter fell softly through the pines, individual flakes catching the morning light like microscopic prisms. I adjusted my position on the rocky outcropping, focusing my handcrafted telescope on the distant highway. Through the lens, I could make out the flashing lights of search vehicles, the third major effort in the 5 months since my disappearance. Behind me, Kasha made a soft vocalization, a question about the time. I responded without turning, my throat now capable of approximating their complex language after months of intensive training. She settled beside me, her massive frame dwarfing mine despite her being considered small among her kind. They will not find anything, she said in carefully practiced English. Our exchanges alternated between languages, my learning theirs, her perfecting ours. The evidence is gone. I nodded, thinking of the elaborate efforts they'd made to eliminate all traces of my presence. My camp had been disassembled, components scattered across 50 kilometers of wilderness. My vehicle had been driven to a ravine in Quebec, carefully staged to suggest an accident or intentional disappearance. Even my scent trails had been methodically obscured, using techniques that demonstrated their profound understanding of human tracking methods. The official search had been downgraded from missing person to presumed deceased after the discovery of blood evidence. My blood, harvested during my integration ceremony and strategically placed to suggest a wildlife attack. Your family grieves, Kasha said, her deep-set eyes studying my expression with the penetrating intelligence that still unsettled me after months of daily contact. This troubles you. It wasn't a question. Their species, which I now knew called themselves something that roughly translated as the first people, possessed emotional perception far exceeding human capabilities. They detected minute changes in body temperature, scent markers, and micro-expressions that made deception virtually impossible. Yes, I admitted. My mother will never know what happened to me, like she never knew the truth about her father. Kasha made a low, rumbling sound, their expression of empathy. The separation protects them as much as us. Knowledge brings danger. I had learned the truth of this statement during my integration. The history of interaction between their kind and humans stretched back thousands of years, documented in their oral traditions with precise detail. Early encounters had often ended in violence, leading to their deliberate strategy of cultivating folklore and myth as camouflage. What humans dismissed as superstition, Sasquatch, Wendigo, the wild men of the woods, served as perfect concealment. When evidence occasionally emerged, it was discredited by its association with these legends. The rare human witnesses who persisted too loudly in their claims tended to disappear, their evidence with them. "Walker comes," Kasia said, rising to her full height of nearly 8 feet. Against the snow-covered landscape, her reddish-brown hair appeared almost black, a stark contrast to the lighter facial coloration that distinguished females of her lineage. I followed her gaze to the forest below, where Walker emerged from the tree line. In the months since our first meeting, I'd learned his true history. How he'd been chosen for integration after accidentally photographing a family group in 1986. How he'd served as intermediary during rare instances when hikers or researchers strayed too close to sensitive territories. He climbed the slope with the fluid efficiency he'd adopted from his hosts, a blend of human and non-human movement patterns that I was slowly learning to replicate. "The council has reached a decision," he announced without preamble. "Your request has been approved." My heart raced. For weeks I'd been advocating for a revolutionary proposal, controlled, limited evidence release to select human scientists. Nothing definitive, nothing irrefutable, but enough to redirect research into evolutionary history along more accurate paths. "All of it?" I asked, scarcely believing my success. "Modified terms," Walker clarified. "No photographs, no DNA samples, only your written observations, structured as theoretical scholarship based on indigenous oral histories. Publication through your grandfather's former colleague at the University of British Columbia." It was less than I'd hoped, but more than I'd expected. The council, consisting of elder representatives from 7 major lineages, maintained rigid protocols about human interaction. That they'd agreed to any information release represented unprecedented progress. "When?" I asked. "The winter gathering, after final approval from all lineages." Walker turned to Kasia. "The Sister Lakes community has concerns about specific details. They request your lineage's intervention." Kasia made a gesture of acknowledgement, a complex movement involving both hands that conveyed respect, obligation, and mild frustration simultaneously. The political dynamics between lineages remained largely opaque to me, though I was learning to recognize the patterns of alliance and opposition. As they discussed the diplomatic nuances in their native language, too rapid and complex for my developing comprehension, I turned back to my telescope, focusing again on the distant search vehicles. A pang of genuine grief hit me as I imagined my mother receiving updates from the provincial police, hoping for closure that would never truly come. The irony wasn't lost on me. I had come to these woods seeking evidence of an undiscovered species, driven by my grandfather's mysterious legacy. Instead, I had discovered an entire parallel society, not merely surviving alongside human civilization, but actively managing human awareness through generations of calculated intervention. Their technological development had followed entirely different paths from humanity's. While they possessed nothing resembling electronics or modern machinery, their understanding of botanical compounds, weather patterns, and ecosystem management far surpassed contemporary human science. Their linguistic capabilities included communication methods beyond human auditory range, explaining how they coordinated complex movements without visible signals. Most humbling was their historical knowledge. Oral traditions maintained with such precision that they could describe climate conditions from 12,000 years ago. The arrival of the first human bands across the Bering Land Bridge, the rise and fall of indigenous nations long before European contact. Walker and Kasia concluded their discussion and turned to me. "It's time," Walker said. "The northern bands are gathering. 3 days' journey." I nodded, making a final adjustment to my telescope before carefully packing it away. This would be my first major gathering, representatives from lineages across the continent converging for the winter conclave. According to Walker, fewer than 10 humans had ever witnessed such an event in recorded history. As we descended the ridge, Kasha moved ahead with characteristic grace despite her size, identifying the path that would keep us concealed from any distant observers. Walker fell into step beside me. "You still doubt your choice," he said, not a question, but an observation. "Not doubt," I clarified. "Adjustment. Everything I knew about evolutionary history, about human uniqueness, is incomplete," he finished. "Not wrong, just missing crucial chapters. Your grandfather understood this. It's why they respected him despite their disagreements." We walked in silence for several minutes, the snow deepening around us. Ahead, Kasha paused at a stream crossing, surveying the opposite bank with practiced caution before proceeding. "Will they ever reveal themselves fully?" I asked. "If human development continues to encroach on their territories, their isolation becomes increasingly difficult to maintain." Walker's expression grew distant, thoughtful. "They've survived ice ages, megafauna extinctions, the European colonization, and the Industrial Revolution. Each time adapting, retreating when necessary, eliminating threats when required. They think in generational timescales we can barely comprehend." "That's not an answer," I pressed. He smiled slightly. "They have contingency plans, multiple scenarios developed over centuries. Some involve controlled revelation under specific conditions. Others," he hesitated, "are less optimistic about human reaction." I thought of the stone figure with human teeth, the warning it represented. Despite months of integration, despite being accepted into daily life with Kasha's family group, I remained acutely aware of the current beneath the surface. The factions Walker had mentioned during our first meeting, those who viewed humanity as an existential threat to be managed rather than engaged. Ahead, Kasha had stopped again, her posture alert. She made a short, sharp vocalization that raised the hair on my neck, a warning call I'd learned to recognize. Walker immediately moved to a defensive position, scanning the forest with practiced efficiency. "What is it?" I whispered, instinctively reaching for the stone knife I now carried at my waist. A gift from Kasha's lineage elder, marking my acceptance into their extended family structure. "Humans," Walker replied tersely. "Not search teams. Hunters. Too close to the gathering route." Kasha made another sound. A question about intervention. Walker responded with a complex series of vocalizations that I interpreted as a debate about options. I caught references to boundary markers and deterrence protocols. The decision came quickly. Kasha melted into the forest with astonishing silence for her size, heading toward the hunter's position. Walker turned to me. "This is your test," he said quietly. "The Council wants to observe your response to human proximity. Your loyalty remains under evaluation." I understood the implications immediately. How I acted in the next few minutes would determine my status within their society, and possibly whether my information release would be approved. After 5 months of integration, I was still not fully trusted. With good reason, perhaps. The pull of human contact, of returning to my former life, remained powerful despite everything I'd learned and experienced. The hunters represented a potential link to that world, people who could carry word of my survival and my mother's grief, restore my human connections, all at the cost of betraying those who had shared their existence with me. I made my decision. 20 minutes later, we continued our journey northward. Behind us, the hunters were already returning to their vehicles, thoroughly convinced that the sudden equipment failures, disorienting trail markers, and unsettling vocalizations from all directions indicated they had strayed into territory better left unexplored. They would return with another story of unexplained wilderness experiences, another contribution to the folklore that had protected the first people for millennia. Their report would join thousands of similar accounts, dismissed by science, preserved in campfire stories and internet forums, maintaining the protective shroud of implausibility that remained the most effective camouflage in an age of ubiquitous technology. As we crossed into deeper wilderness, beyond any human trails or monitoring systems, Kasha dropped back to walk beside me. Without words, she extended her massive hand, palm up, a gesture of approval and acceptance I had earned through my choice. I placed my hand on hers, feeling the immense strength carefully restrained. Ahead lay the gathering of the first people, and my formal presentation to their full council. Behind us, The last traces of my human life vanished beneath the steadily falling snow, covering our tracks in ways both literal and symbolic. I had crossed a boundary few humans had ever approached. Not just a physical territory, but a threshold of understanding about our species' place in evolutionary history, one of several intelligent hominids that had competed, coexisted, and occasionally interbred across hundreds of thousands of years. The snow continued to fall as we moved deeper into their world, erasing the boundary between what was known and what remained hidden in the whispers of the pines.